They thought time would erase the evidence, but justice has a memory, and it's getting smarter. Old crimes are colliding with new technology, and the past? It's finally answering back. These are 25 disturbing cold cases finally solved after years of tears and questions. Case 1. Austin Yogurt Shop Murders, 1991, Texas, USA. On the night of December 6, 1991, the quiet stretch of Anderson Lane in North Austin held one more routine closing shift at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas manned the register. Sarah Harbison and their friend Amy Ayers came by for a ride home. No one suspected what tragedy awaited. Within hours, all four would be gone, tied, shot, and trapped beneath flames. As the city slept, brutality ripped through the life of a community. At about 11 p.m., the yogurt shop locked its doors. Minutes earlier, Jennifer and Eliza had logged out the registers. Sarah and Amy lingered, waiting for a ride. Reports say a man was permitted to use the back bathroom and lingered. Some patrons leaving saw two men acting furtively inside. When the fire alarm triggered around midnight, a patrol officer called in flames at the store. Firefighters burst through smoke and ash and discovered the charred bodies of 4 teenage girls. The scene was horrific. The girls had been stripped, gagged, bound, some with their own underwear, and shot at close range. Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza had been shot in the back of the head. Amy was found in a separate area, partially spared from burning, but riddled with gunshot wounds and ligature marks. Some survived the blaze only briefly, perhaps trying to crawl away before succumbing to their injuries. Investigators recovered a few critical, fragile pieces, a .380 caliber shell casing partially lodged near a drain, burned but retrievable. Biological swabs and tissue samples survived in the wreckage. Under Amy Ayers' fingernails, investigators found trace male DNA, small fragments that would become central decades later. The arson had been calculated: accelerants, fire, destruction of traces. The crime scene was a canvas of horror, and many evidentiary tracks vanished in smoke and water. From the first hours, the Austin Police Department's homicide unit mobilized, scouring the scene, canvassing nearby homes, seeking witnesses and surveillance. Hundreds of tips poured in. Investigators ran credit card receipts, traced cash purchases at the shop, interviewed teenage acquaintances, and even collected discarded soda cans, cigarette butts, and car parts believed tied to suspects. Ballistics teams analyzed the .380 casing, comparing it to NIBIN, National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, entries. No match surfaced. DNA labs attempted STR profiling from vaginal swab and undernail samples. Results were partial and inconsistent, yielding no CODIS, Combined DNA Index System hits. The evidence, degraded, limited, mixed, could not be conclusively matched to any living suspect. In 1999, APD made arrests. 4 men then young, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were taken in for questioning. Springsteen and Scott confessed and implicated each other. These statements formed the core of the prosecution's case. The trial of Springsteen began in 2001, and Scott's in 2002. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the confessions, cross-implicating each man through statements they claimed the other had given. But investigators never produced forensic evidence directly linking them to the crime scene. The confessions were the cornerstone, and the case rested on them, tenuous as they were. Once the trials ended and appeals began, the case stagnated. The confessions, later revealed to be extracted under duress, were unraveling. Critics pointed to aggressive interrogation, psychological pressure, and inconsistency. By 2007, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Springsteen's conviction, ruling that the prosecution had violated the defendant's confrontation rights by admitting statements each had made about the other. Springsteen's was a death sentence. Scott's was life. By 2009, new DNA evidence had conclusively excluded both men from the crime scene. All charges were dismissed. As time passed, jurors from the original trials stated that if they had known what was later discovered, and that Springsteen and Scott lacked DNA matches, they likely would not have convicted. The district attorney's office held fast. The unknown male DNA that had surfaced demanded resolution before retrial. But legislative, procedural, and scientific constraints stalled any further prosecution. The case slid into the cold case vault, its memory sustained by victim families and occasional media interest. As DNA technology evolved elsewhere, investigators kept small hope alive, but the scientific margin remained thin. In the early 2020s, investigators revisited the evidence with fresh eyes. APD resubmitted the .380 shell to NIBIN again, this time with updated ballistic comparisons. The casing matched a firearm tied to a 1998 crime in Kentucky. The same gun was used in a murder in that state. That gun had a documented association: Robert Eugene Brashers, a violent offender with a record of rape and murder across multiple states: Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, Georgia, Texas. Meanwhile, forensic labs expanded the original YSTR profile from around 16 male markers to 27, shipping it into genealogical databases. Investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, teams constructed family trees, built out from distal male line descendants, and triangulated toward Brasher's lineage. The pattern matched Brasher's known movement across southern states. Investigators then revisited the undernail DNA fragment from Amy Ayers, employing high-sensitivity autosomal methods. That DNA fragment, though small, matched Brasher's with odds at roughly 2.5 million to 1. 2. Seal the case. Authorities obtained a court-authorized exhumation of Brasher's remains. He had died by suicide during a police standoff in 1999. Post-mortem nuclear DNA testing came back as a definitive match across autosomal and YSTR loci. At the same time, ballistic experts confirmed that the .380 shell found in Austin closely matched the gun Brasher's used in other murders. Consistent striations, markings, and ballistic fingerprint evidence. Investigative teams eliminated alternate genealogical branches and ensured consistency across timelines, geographic proximity, and behavioral patterns. The weight of combined evidence left little room for doubt. Because Robert Eugene Brashers died in 1999, no arrest or trial was possible. The two men originally convicted, Springsteen and Scott, remained exonerated. They had spent years behind bars on false confessions and were released without further prosecution. No other living suspect has been charged. The case now stands on posthumous identification, a technical closure in a tragedy that yielded no living reckoning. The official status is closed, suspect deceased, posthumous identification. Many in the Austin PD and Travis County now regard the identification as a vindication of forensic rigor and the persistence of scientific method. But there was never a court to test motives, co-conspirators, or context. Public record links Brashers to a spectrum of violent crimes: rape, abduction, murder. He had prior convictions across multiple states, and his modus operandi aligns with the yogurt shop atrocity: control, sexual violence, destruction of evidence. But in this case, motive remains speculative. Absence of confession, absence of trial, absence of first-hand testimony. The precise reason he targeted those girls, or whether he had accomplices, remains unresolved in public domain. This case is now being held up as one of the emblematic successes of modern cold case science. It demonstrates how arson, ballistic reanalysis, YSTR expansion, IgG, and postmortem exhumation can converge to solve a crime once thought lost. But the story is also a cautionary one: that wrongful confessions can derail justice, that evidence must be preserved meticulously, that prosecutorial zeal without physical corroboration is dangerous. In 2017, when Austin prosecutors and investigators first attempted to use federal YSTR databases, they encountered resistance from the FBI over privacy and legal restrictions, a stalemate that delayed progress. This conflict showed that science alone is not enough. Law, policy, and institutional will matter. Thank you for still watching this video. Pause for just a second and subscribe to this channel. By the way, we will love to know where you are watching us from. Let's know in the comments section. Now, let's continue. Case 2. The Silent Whispers. Laura Kempton, 1981. The room was unlocked. The summons lay useless in hand. When Officer Ron Grivois entered apartment near 2 at 20 Chapel Street that morning, he expected a parking ticket dispute, not a murder scene. What he found instead, a young woman, bound at the ankles with a cord, the phone line twisted across her neck, and blood pooled beneath her head. Her name, Laura Kempton, age 23. Her killer remained anonymous for more than 4 decades. It was 9:30 a.m. on Monday, September 28, 1981, when Portsmouth police attempted to serve a court summons to Laura Kempton for unpaid parking violations. When the front panel of her apartment door, among the missing bits, gave way, the flat was silent and still. Behind the threshold, they glimpsed bedding askew, a blanket draped awkwardly, and legs jutting from beneath. Laura lay motionless. Her body bore terrible signs of violence. The medical examiner later documented massive blunt force trauma to the left side of her skull, deep lacerations and brain hemorrhage. The binding on her ankles, the cord across her neck, and signs of sexual assault all spoke of a brutal personal attack. Investigators also noted blood-soaked rugs, broken glass, and a wine or glass bottle believed to have been used in the assault. Among the preserved evidence were a cigarette butt, pillow with touch DNA, and fragments of glass, all stored carefully for future re-examination. Laura had ventured out the night before with a friend and returned alone. She was a student in Portsmouth Beauty School, supplementing her income with jobs at Karen's Ice Cream and a local gift shop. Outgoing, stylish, she had a life in motion. But on that morning, something monstrous intruded, and her world ended. The case fell under jurisdiction of the Portsmouth Police Department, with collaboration from the New Hampshire Attorney General's office over time. Detectives and crime scene teams processed the apartment, cataloged broken door parts, and collected the blood, hair, fingernail, touch DNA, and glass fragments. Interviews began immediately. Friends, acquaintances, neighbors, building residents, and nightlife contacts. Some leads emerged. A man called JR who had accompanied Laura earlier that night, but DNA comparison later excluded him. Over the years, cold case units and forensic staff maintained the chain of custody and preserved samples for retesting. Periodic reviews probed burglary leads, local criminals, and any name-based suspects approaching the age and profile suggested by the limited DNA. But without a reliable match, the case remained unresolved. Despite early optimism, investigators confronted significant obstacles. The evidence, though preserved, was modest in volume and worn by time. The partial male DNA extracted from the cigarette butt and other touch samples yielded profiles insufficient for match in CODIS or state databases for decades. ABC News. Some suspects died, moved, or fell out of police radar. Witnesses faded, memories obscured. The case lacked sustained priority and consistent resources in. Another barrier. The idea of using genetic genealogy in 20th century cold cases was nascent and controversial. Legal frameworks and institutional protocols had not yet accommodated uploading partial or SNP-based DNA profiles to consumer databases. The method was still unproven, and many cold case units hesitated to adopt it. As years passed, funding and attention shifted to more recent crimes. The quiet accumulation of technological advances, however, kept the possibility alive. In late 2022, a decisive pivot arrived. The preserved DNA evidence, especially from the cigarette butt and vaginal other swabs, was reprocessed using whole genome SNP extraction, generating a profile suitable for genealogical matching. That profile was uploaded to public genetic genealogy databases. Within months, matches to distant relatives appeared, mapped to branches of family trees. Genealogists and investigators traced 2 closely linked branches, narrowing to one candidate, Ronnie James Lee. Lee had died in 2005 from acute cocaine intoxication, ruling out arrest or trial. Investigators then sought and obtained a court-authorized exhumation to test his remains, comparing his DNA to crime scene samples. The The results confirmed a match across multiple loci. Simultaneously, genealogical elimination techniques excised alternative branches, and investigative cross-checks aligned Lee's age, 21 in 1981, his known residences, his criminal record in burglary and sexual assault, and his proximity to Portsmouth at the time. The total evidence chain converged. In July 2023, the New Hampshire Department of Justice publicly announced that the DNA evidence establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that Lee committed first-degree murder. Had he lived, he would face charges including aggravated sexual assault and murder via blunt injurious weapon, likely the glass bottle. Because Ronnie James Lee died in 2005, no arrest or prosecution could occur. The case stands as a posthumous identification. No living suspect remains under indictment. No releases or retrials occur, since no convicted person is implicated now. The old suspects were never prosecuted in this case. The official status: closed, solved, suspect deceased. Prosecutors described the crime as a calculated break-in and sexually motivated assault that escalated into lethal violence. The likely weapon: a glass bottle. The motive remains inferred, that the attacker intended intrusion or sexual assault, but the sequence escalated in violence beyond intent. Without trial or confession, motive remains in the realm of strong allegation, not judicial proof. When the 2023 announcement broke, the Kempton family released a statement. Their diligence and determination, along with extraordinary personal commitment over the past decades, have led to this moment for Laura. They asked for privacy, while expressing relief that cold case investigators never turned away from her. Case. Portsmouth was awash in memories, of a girl walking home, of an ominous silence that followed, of a community haunted. Local press revisited past reporting, drawing parallels with another Portsmouth murder, Tammy Little, 1982, who attended the same beauty school and died of blunt trauma in her apartment. The parallels remain unresolved but haunting. In that press conference, Attorney General John Formella called the resolution bittersweet, stating that had Lee lived, he'd face first-degree charges. Portsmouth Police Chief Mark Newport affirmed that Laura's killing had never been forgotten by investigators. The social impact rippled. Local interest in cold case DNA grew. Lab budgets were reevaluated, and families of unsolved homicide victims felt a renewal of hope. Case 3. Brian Patrick Miller, Canal Killer, early 1990s, Arizona, USA. Before she became the first horror in the Canal saga, Angela Brasso, 22, was a young woman with promise. She walked the path of Arizona lives, studying, working, riding her bicycle at dusk to unwind. The November 1992 night she vanished was unremarkable, until it wasn't. When authorities found her body near a canal trail in North Phoenix, bound and limbless, the community recoiled. Her head would emerge 11 days later, floating near a canal grate. A year later, Melanie Bernas, 17, would bicycling outdoors on September 21, 1993, vanish under the same sky. She was last seen alive near that stretch of canal, less than 2 miles from where Angela's head had been found. The next morning, her body surfaced in the water. She bore stab wounds, signs of sexual assault, and horrifying mutilation. Her bicycle was gone. The parallels were chilling. Same terrain, same method, same threatening silence. But across years, that silence would speak through lab vials and genealogical trees. On November 8, 1992, a passing bicyclist noticed a body half submerged along the edge of Phoenix's canal path. It was Angela, stripped, mutilated, her head severed. The medical examiner detected consistent wounds to her back, precise slashes, and post-mortem sexual assault. Roughly 10 days later, her head was recovered floating downstream, impaled on a metal grate. It was an execution. In 1993, less than 1 mile away, Melanie's fate echoed the pattern. A cyclist discovered a pool of blood near the canal trail where the head first surfaced. Following drag marks led to Melanie's body. She had been stabbed from behind, her clothes discarded. Investigators later noted the killer had dressed her in a teal bodysuit, something she did not own. These two women had been violently snatched from the evening calm, then erased. At each scene, forensic teams collected biological evidence: semen, trace DNA on clothing, knife wound edges, touch DNA on fabric, even fibers. Investigators initially treated the crimes separately, but after advanced testing years later, DNA tied both victims to the same unknown male. The signature brutality and precise murder suggested a killer with surgical intent or obsession. The Phoenix Police Department homicide and cold case units opened both investigations. Detectives patrolled canals at night, set trail cameras, interviewed residents near watercourses, and traced tip lines for suspicious bicyclists or drifters. They amassed maps of dump sites, timed fits of victim travel routes, and compiled internal master lists. Laboratories processed the evidence, running STR profiles, Y chromosome markers, and comparing them to CODIS entries. Though some DNA clues surfaced, no match appeared in national databases. Witness leads, men seen walking near canals, individuals with histories of assault, were interrogated, sampled, or eliminated. Detectives logged more than 600 persons of interest over decades. Oxygen. Publicity campaigns, reward flyers, and press bulletins spurred tips, but none stuck. The canal paths were open access. A suspect could vanish upstream, downstream, or across neighborhoods. Investigators kept the files alive, maintaining chain of custody, preserving evidence and reviewing progress as new forensic tools emerged. The canal murders entered a long freeze. DNA samples were often low quantity, degraded, or impure, making STR matching unreliable. The Y chromosome markers were insufficiently discriminating to pinpoint a suspect. Combined with limited databases in the 1990s and early 2000s, the evidence remained silent. Without new leads, investigators grew frustrated. Memory faded, witnesses relocated or died, and funding for cold case forensics remained sparse. Institutional inertia slowed adoption of experimental science. The elevated brutality and randomness made profiling suspects difficult. No clear geographical cluster stood out. Additionally, the killer's enigmatic persona, when later revealed, masked him. Over years, community chatter speculated. Investigators chased ghosts, but the killer stayed hidden. The case became emblematic of unsolved Arizona crime, a haunting whisper in police records. The turning moment came in 2014 at a forensic DNA conference. Phoenix detectives heard of Colleen Fitzpatrick, founder of Identifinders International, who claimed she could transform male Y profiles into surname leads via genealogy. Investigators sent the Canal case DNA profile to Fitzpatrick's team, who ran analytics through public databases and matching tools. Her team identified 6 surname candidates, including Miller. Detective Clark Schwarzkopf, later cold case lead, revisited internal master lists, uncovering Brian Patrick Miller, a name listed years earlier but never fully investigated. Records revealed Miller, then in his early 40s, had histories in amusement cosplay and local performance, and an earlier 1989 stabbing when he was 16, tied to a woman named Celeste Bentley. Investigators arranged covert DNA collection by inviting Miller to a restaurant, Chili's, serving him a drink in a glass later collected for testing. That DNA sample matched the Canal crime scene evidence from both Angela and Melanie. Police arrested him in January 2015. The genealogy to arrest route was surgical. Fitzpatrick's Y-line leads, elimination of alternate Miller branches, timeline fits, and Miller's prior record all aligned. The breakthrough was less a lightning bolt than a decades-long germination of science enabling connection. On January 14, 2015, Brian Patrick Miller was arrested on charges including 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Miller did not confess. Initially, he denied remembering the events. He waived a jury trial, opting for a bench trial under Judge Suzanne Cohen, beginning in October 2022. His defense admitted he was responsible, but argued not guilty by reason of insanity, citing dissociative amnesia stemming from severe childhood abuse, particularly by his mother, a correctional officer. Miller claimed he couldn't recall his role in the murders, though he denied wrongdoing. The trial's medical testimony was fierce. Prosecution psychiatrists countered that while Miller had psychological trauma, it did not absolve control. In April 2023, Judge Cohen found him guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, 2 counts, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault. In June 2023, the death penalty was imposed. Judge Cohen emphasized the cruelty of the crimes. He did not just murder them, he brutalized them and evaded capture for decades. Miller's case triggered automatic appeals, and the sentencing integrated considerations of his age, abuse history, but weighed them insufficient to spare his sentence. Miller did not testify. During sentencing, victim impact statements delivered piercing reflections. Angela's mother lamented, "He stole my angel. I will never plan her wedding." Melanie's sister said, "We live without her smile. Every single day is pain." Thus, the Canal murders, once cold, were etched in final verdict. Official status: closed. Convicted: death sentence rendered. Motive, as developed by prosecution, centers on sexual predation, obsessive control, and violence. Miller's fantasies about abduction and death, documented in his teenage notebooks, were referenced in court. The alignment of his juvenile record, stalking interests, cosplay obsession, and psychological history framed a portrait of a man whose latent fantasies found real victims. Defense experts contended his mental trauma impaired memory, but the court found he retained culpable capacity. While motive was never admitted by Miller, the evidence narrative argues he gravitated toward women bicycling at dusk, using anonymity of canals to execute his dark compulsion. The full breadth of motive, why those victims, why then, remains partly unsaid. For 30 years, Angela's and Melanie's families bore helpless silence. When the guilty verdict came, the courtroom wept. Angela's mother called him a thief of dreams. Melanie's sister spoke of unbearable emptiness. Phoenix law enforcement lauded the case as a turning point in cold case work, especially in Arizona's adoption of investigative genetic genealogy. Detective Schwarzkopf later said that day when geneticists whispered Miller was the most intense moment of his career. Media framed Miller's public persona, the costumed zombie hunter, as grotesque irony, a man who wore a mask in public while hiding real monsters in private. Reports revealed he would drive a stylized police car, attend fandom events, and pose with law enforcement in costume, camouflage behind the macabre. From the streets to death row, Miller now occasionally exchanges messages with reporters, claiming he doesn't remember and denying guilt. But the DNA evidence, courtroom judgments, and victim stories mark finality for many. Case 4. Terry McAdams, 1985, Texas, USA. February 14, 1985. Arlington, Texas. A soft breeze drifted through the open sliding glass door of a second-floor apartment. Inside, a small heart-shaped cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter. It was pink, decorated by hand, and meant for a quiet Valentine's night in. But its recipient, 26-year-old Terry McAdams, never got the chance to see it. Terry's roommate returned that evening to a scene no one should ever have to witness. The apartment was quiet, eerily so. There were signs of a struggle. The back door, which led to the apartment's balcony, had been forced open. Terry's body was found inside the bedroom. The medical examiner later determined that she had endured a violent attack. Her injuries were severe. It was clear that whoever entered the home that day didn't just take a life. They destroyed an entire world. Police arrived shortly after the call. Investigators with the Arlington Police Department and Tarrant County law enforcement secured the apartment. They began a meticulous search for clues. They found biological evidence. A sexual assault kit was performed. They collected fibers, clothing, and other physical materials that might one day tell a story science could not yet explain. But in 1985, DNA technology was still in its infancy. There were no matches, no names, just a long list of unanswered questions. The investigation began with urgency. Detectives canvassed the apartment complex and surrounding area. They interviewed neighbors, tried to reconstruct Terry's final hours, but leads dried up quickly. No one saw anything. No one heard the break-in. And despite every effort, the trail went cold. A composite sketch couldn't be drawn. No fingerprints identified a suspect. And with no forced entry at the front, suspicion narrowed to the back door. The sliding glass panel, often overlooked in security conversations, had become the killer's path. Terry McAdams wasn't just another name in a file. She was a young woman in the prime of her life. She had dreams, family, plans. She was known for her warmth, her ability to light up a room, and her unwavering loyalty to those she loved. Her death left a hole in her family, a void that deepened as the years dragged on. As the calendar flipped from 1985 to 1986, then to 1990, then to 2000, the box containing her case file gathered dust. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. The roommate who found her left the state. Her loved ones tried to move on, but every February became a painful anniversary. For decades, the question of who did this and why remained an open wound. Then, in the early 2020s, something changed. A new generation of detectives took over the cold case unit at Arlington PD. With advances in forensic science, they began reviewing decades-old evidence in a new light. Among them was the sexual assault kit from Terry's case. It had been preserved carefully. The DNA within it had never yielded a result before. But now, with new extraction techniques, the lab pulled a viable profile, a male suspect. Still, the CODIS system, the National DNA Database, didn't turn up a match. Whoever did this had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. But the investigators had another tool, a revolutionary one: investigative genetic genealogy, IgG. The sample was sent to specialists trained in building family trees from DNA. They uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases, ones used by people looking for distant cousins or ancestral origins. Matches began to appear. Distant relatives at first, then closer ones. Through painstaking tree building and genealogical triangulation, one name began to rise. The team narrowed down the list through location, age, and other historical markers. They looked for someone who lived in Texas at the time, someone without an alibi, someone who fit what little profile they had. Eventually, one candidate stood out. He had lived near Terry's apartment in 1985. He had no known relationship with her, but his proximity raised red flags. Investigators began quiet surveillance. They collected a discarded item, trash DNA, and sent it to the lab for comparison. The result was clear. The DNA was a match. In 2024, nearly 40 years after the crime, the identity of Terry McAdams' killer was finally known. Law enforcement confirmed the link through both autosomal and YSTR testing. The statistical probability of someone else matching was astronomically low, yet the name was not released publicly. At the time of discovery, no arrest had been made, or at least none confirmed to the media. The man may have died, or charges may still be pending under grand jury review. But for the family, that name, even if whispered only in private, changed everything. The motive. Authorities believe it was opportunistic. There was no evidence of a relationship, no history of stalking or threats. Just an open door and a man who decided to take what was never his. It was a crime of violence and domination, not passion. On a day meant for love, he brought death. The community's response was quiet but profound. News of the case being solved after decades brought both relief and renewed grief. Friends who hadn't spoken in years called each other. Former neighbors remembered the police sirens, the shock, the fear of living near a killer they never knew was there. Local media outlets covered the update. For once, it wasn't just another tragedy, it was closure, or at least the start of it. Detectives involved in the case spoke publicly about the value of IgG. They called it a game changer. They noted how many more cases might be solvable if agencies had the funding, the will, and the patience. But they also cautioned, behind every match is a family and a ripple effect. Behind every identification is a victim whose name finally gets justice. For Terry's family, the confirmation brought a complicated mix of feelings. Relief that the truth had finally emerged, sorrow that it took this long, and rage that the person who stole her life may have lived his for decades, uninterrupted. Terry McAdams was buried long ago, but her story never truly rested. And now, with science, persistence, and the quiet power of a preserved evidence box, her voice finally returned. Her name will no longer live only in police files or aging newspaper clippings. It will live in courtrooms, in forensics textbooks, and in every cold case detectives hope that even after 40 years, the truth can still win. The cake was never eaten, but the story, at last, is finished. Case 5. The Nation River Lady. Jewel Parchman Langford, 1975, Ontario, Canada. The sun had just begun to rise over the Nation River. A light mist clung to the water, and the air carried that damp, earthy scent that comes right after rain. That morning, May 3, 1975, should have passed like any other in the sleepy farming community near Castleman, Ontario. But a local farmer noticed something just beneath the surface, drifting slowly with the current. It wasn't a log. It wasn't debris. It was a woman's body, bound, violated, and tossed away like she didn't matter. For 50 years, no one knew her name. But someone knew what happened, and someone never forgot her. She was found floating about 100 yards downstream from the Highway 417 bridge. Her hands and ankles had been tied with men's neckties. A tea towel covered her face. Wrapped tightly around her neck was a flat, plastic-covered television cable, her likely cause of death. The strangulation had been deliberate and cold. The scene told investigators one thing: this wasn't random. It was personal. Bloodstains were also discovered on the bridge above, leading detectives to believe she'd been thrown from it. She had no ID, no wallet, no identifying jewelry, just her remains, her clothes, and the silence of the river. The Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, took charge of the investigation, but in 1975, forensic tools were limited. Detectives tried missing persons cross-matching across Ontario and nearby provinces. They kept her clothes, preserved her remains, and even tried clay facial reconstructions and sketches. Years passed. Nothing. No one came forward. No match surfaced. She was buried without a name, becoming known only as the Nation River Lady. In those early years, jurisdiction was a problem. Later, investigators would learn she had been reported missing in the U.S., but that report came out of Montreal, and she was a U.S. citizen. That created gaps between local, provincial, and federal agencies. The woman vanished in one country, was discovered in another, and her family lived in a third. Interagency coordination just wasn't built for that in the 1970s. Add to that the fact her body was severely decomposed, and the forensic DNA tools of the time couldn't deliver a usable profile. The case went cold, not for lack of effort, but because time had buried her deeper than the river ever could. By the late 2010s, Detective Inspector Daniel Nadeau and Detective Constable Janice Mulcock picked up the cold case for review. In 2019, they secured approval to exhume the remains. This time, they weren't looking for fingerprints. They were looking for DNA, and this time, technology was ready. The OPP brought in the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Using state-of-the-art sequencing, they extracted a high-quality DNA profile. This wasn't just the standard STR profile used in law enforcement databases like CODIS. This was full genome sequencing. They uploaded the results to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, where volunteer genealogists began building family trees based on shared DNA markers. The goal? Work backward from second, third, or even fourth cousins until you zero in on one individual. That effort paid off in 2020. A likely match emerged. Jewel Parchman Langford, a Tennessee-born American citizen who had been living in Montreal around the time of her disappearance. She was last seen in April 1975, just days before the body was discovered. She hadn't vanished. She'd been murdered. And someone had gotten away with it. But who? Investigators dug into her past and found a man named Rodney Nichols. He and Langford had lived together in Montreal in the 1970s. He was a Canadian citizen. He had no serious criminal record. But he had vanished around the same time she did. and resurfaced years later in Florida, living quietly, avoiding attention. When police retraced Langford's timeline, they found multiple links placing her and Nichols in close proximity shortly before her death. The suspicion deepened. In 2023, Ontario authorities secured a warrant and formally charged Nichols, by now in his 80s, with first-degree murder. He was extradited from Florida back to Canada. The DNA had spoken. Confirmatory testing between Langford's remains and living family members sealed the match. Investigators ruled out alternate suspects and cross-validated the timeline of her disappearance, relationship history, and movement between cities. Nichols became the only viable suspect. Still, motive remains murky. Publicly available documents suggest Nichols and Langford were in a troubled relationship. She had been trying to distance herself. Some family accounts imply that he grew controlling, but the case files haven't yet detailed why he killed her, or how their final interaction unfolded. What is known is that she never made it back to Tennessee. Her family never heard from her again. Langford's niece, Denise Chung, told reporters that her grandmother spent decades searching. She hired private investigators, contacted the FBI, filed reports, and followed dead ends across 3 countries. She died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. For Denise, the DNA call in 2020 brought relief, but also reopened wounds long buried. The trial is still pending. Nichols has not entered a plea, and legal proceedings are ongoing. At his age, he may not live to face a full trial. But to the OPP, the significance of the case goes beyond this one man. They believe it sets a precedent for how forensic genealogy can reach across decades and borders to bring justice. For cold cases, it's a new dawn. The Nation River still flows beneath the bridge where she was thrown. But this time, the silence doesn't carry her name. We finally know who she was. Jewel, daughter, partner, woman, human, and above all, no longer forgotten. Case 6, Elizabeth Precious Jane Doe, Roberts, 1977, W.A. Orr, USA. On August 14, 1977, just outside Everett, Washington, a quiet stretch of woods concealed a story that would take over 4 decades to fully begin. A young woman's body was found near a forested embankment, hidden just enough from the road to avoid immediate discovery, but close enough that someone eventually would. When authorities arrived, they found the remains of a teenage girl, bound, strangled, and shot multiple times. Her identity was a mystery. Her killer, unknown. For nearly 43 years, she was referred to as nothing more than Precious Jane Doe. The girl had suffered a violent death. Deep ligature marks on her wrists and neck suggested prolonged restraint and strangulation. Even after death, the brutality continued. There were at least 2 gunshot wounds. She had no belongings, no ID, no clothing with name tags, no dental records matched. Every conventional investigative tool led nowhere. Without a name, she was just another anonymous case, filed away in an evidence box, marked Unsolved. Initial investigators, including members of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and Washington State forensic specialists, tried to piece together who she was and why she had been killed. Composite sketches were released. Her skeletal remains underwent anthropological examination. Investigators cross-checked local missing persons databases. But those systems were limited, both by the time and the nature of the victim's life. She had been a runaway, estranged from her family, and when she turned 18, her missing person listing was purged from the National Records System, a devastating procedural failure that meant fewer and fewer connections could be made. The forensic landscape of the late 70s and early 80s simply wasn't equipped for what this case required. Attempts were made to extract DNA from her bones in the 1990s and early 2000s. Each time, degradation prevented a viable sample. Laboratories across the country tried reprocessing the material, but nothing yielded a usable profile. The case slowly faded into cold storage. Its complexity, combined with limited funding and mounting casework, meant it wasn't a priority anymore. But buried cases have a way of resurfacing, especially when the science catches up to the silence. In the late 2010s, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf from Snohomish County refused to let her story end in silence. By then, investigative genetic genealogy had begun reshaping how law enforcement approached unidentified remains. But this case had another problem. The victim's bones were too degraded, and typical DNA extraction techniques from root-based hair were impossible. The remains had long since been reduced to fragments and rootless strands. That's when Scharf reached out to Dr. Ed Green of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a forensics company named Astrea. Together, they pushed into experimental territory, rootless hair sequencing. This wasn't common practice. In fact, it had never been used to successfully identify a murder victim before. But in this case, it worked. Using whole genome sequencing on several rootless hair samples taken during autopsy and preserved in evidence bags, Dr. Green's team extracted enough SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, to begin creating a comprehensive DNA profile. That profile was uploaded to public genealogical databases, including GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Then came the slow work of tree building. Barbara Ray-Venter and her team at Firebird Forensics combed through the raw data. They cross-referenced potential matches with family trees, census records, and archived obituaries. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Cousins, distant relatives, more fragments of a name and a history. Finally, they arrived at a full name, Elizabeth Ann Roberts, nicknamed Liz or Beth by those who knew her. She had been born in Oregon and later lived with family in the Pacific Northwest before running away as a teenager. Her last known location was somewhere near Seattle. Family records showed that her relatives had long suspected she had died, but had no way to prove it. Her mother died without ever knowing the truth. Once a name was attached, investigators reopened every aspect of the case. They traced Elizabeth's school records, her last employment stubs, and juvenile court documents from when she was in the system. Confirmatory. DNA was collected from surviving family members, matched back to the hair profile, and validated through triangulation methods. Her body was exhumed and finally laid to rest in a family plot under her real name. For the first time in 43 years, she had her identity restored, her dignity reclaimed. She wasn't a case file anymore. She was Elizabeth. But the story didn't end there. With a name came new questions. If she had been killed so violently, who did it, and why? The condition of her body suggested a prolonged period of captivity. The bindings, the marks, the brutality. These weren't the actions of a random stranger. This was targeted, personal. Investigators theorized that she may have been held against her will before her murder. Evidence hinted at sexual assault, though degradation made confirmation difficult. Yet to this day, no one has been formally charged with her murder. No suspect has been named publicly. It remains one of the few cases in the U.S. where the victim was successfully identified through rootless hair DNA, but where the killer remains unknown. Detective Scharf has remained committed to finding justice. He stated in interviews that giving Elizabeth her name back was never enough. Someone took her life. Someone out there knows. The community responded with empathy and anger. Local media covered her reburial. Members of the public who had followed the case for decades left flowers at her grave. Social media lit up with condolences from strangers who felt oddly close to her. More importantly, the case marked a scientific turning point. Elizabeth became the first homicide victim in the world to be identified through rootless hair sequencing. The method has since been adopted in other cold cases, unlocking dozens of previously hopeless investigations. Her story wasn't just about restoration, it was about evolution. In death, she changed forensic history. To those who worked the case, she was more than just another homicide. She was the girl they couldn't forget, the one who kept reappearing on the cold case board, the one with no name, no voice, until science gave her both. Today, her murder remains open. Leads continue to be investigated. Detectives revisit old interviews, try to match her final movements with police records and possible offenders in the area at that time. There's cautious optimism. As new suspects are cleared or identified, the net tightens. And as technology continues to leap forward, it may only be a matter of time before Elizabeth's killer is named. But even if justice takes another decade, What matters now is that she's not forgotten. Her photo, her name, and her memory now live in public records, court documents, and forensic journals. She is proof that even in the darkest corners of history, light can still break through. Her family, once fractured by silence, is now united in remembrance. They have shared stories, rebuilt her timeline, and finally laid her to rest. For them, the nightmare didn't end in 1977, but it began to shift in 2020. And for the investigators, scientists, and strangers who refused to let her fade into history, Elizabeth Ann Roberts will always be more than a victim. She will always be the one who came home. Case 7. Louisa Dunn, 1967, Bristol, UK, June 28, 1967. In a quiet row of houses in Easton, Bristol, 75-year-old Louisa Dunn was found murdered inside her home. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. For decades, her case remained a dark specter in Avon and Somerset's unsolved files. That day, a neighbor or passerby sensed something amiss. A window ajar, curtains unsettled, silence where there should have been life. They entered and discovered Louisa's body inside her sitting room. She lay close to a front window. The room bore signs of forced entry. Draped, over her lap was a faded blue skirt, an item later preserved as a critical piece of evidence. On the frame of the window, inside and out, investigators found a palm print that would later become central to the case. The medical examiner concluded she had been assaulted and strangled. No immediate suspect came forth. From the very start, investigators worked the scene meticulously. They photographed every angle, measured footprints, collected fabric fibers, and cataloged the palm print and her clothing with care. Early fingerprint comparisons were run through local indexes and national fingerprint bureaus. No match. The skirt was stored, folded, cataloged. The print was dusted, recorded, and archived. Still, the case languished unsolved. The Avon and Somerset Police Homicide and Major Crime Division took lead. Detectives canvassed her neighborhood, seeking witnesses or suspicious visitors. They turned over every lead: local itinerant workers, tram and bus records, people with criminal records elsewhere in the region. The palm print was submitted to the National Fingerprint Database of the era. Unfortunately, at that time, the coverage was limited and many prints remained unindexed or uninterpreted. Suspect lists were generated and discarded as unverified. Physical matches never panned out. For years, the blue skirt and the print remained two of the few preserved physical threads, a piece of fabric and a latent fingerprint. Investigators tracked repairmen, tradespeople, known burglars, and even residents in adjoining houses, but none fit unequivocally. As time passed, memories faded, suspects died or moved away, records were lost or shredded. The case slipped into the archives, given lower priority amid rising caseloads. For decades, forensic options stagnated around fingerprints and visual identification. There was no DNA tech robust enough to work with touch DNA or degraded samples. The skirt sat in storage, the palm print untouched. Then, in the early 2020s, Avon and Somerset police revisited the Dunn file. Advances in touch DNA, improved palm print reprocessing, and genealogy all converged. Investigators re-examined the skirt with modern swabbing techniques, retrieving male DNA traces. Simultaneously, fingerprint examiners reprocessed the stored palm print with new algorithms and scanning techniques, enhancing ridge detail and matching potential. The DNA from the skirt yielded a partial male profile which, while insufficient alone for arrest, was strong enough to run through national forensic genealogy pipelines and commercial matching services. Genealogists constructed family trees based on relatives who shared DNA segments with that profile. Over time, one branch became compelling: Ryland Headley. He had no prior conviction connected to this crime, but had lived locally. His age, elderly but still alive, made him a viable living suspect. Meanwhile, the palm print reanalysis revealed a high probability match to Headley's palm ridge. Patterns in the fingerprint database, once updated with modern scanning methods and comparison software. The convergence was powerful. Both the DNA on the skirt and the palm print pointed to the same man. Investigators then obtained a warrant for a cheek swab from Headley. His DNA matched both the skirt trace and correlated with the palm print identification. Investigators eliminated alternate genealogical branches, verified historical residence patterns, and confirmed that Headley lived within proximity to Louisa during that time. The evidence aligned seamlessly across multiple modalities. With that, police had probable cause. They arrested Headley in 2024, charging him under UK law with rape and murder in respect to Dunn's killing. At trial in 2025, the court considered DNA, fingerprint, and behavioral evidence. Despite his age and infirm health, Headley was found guilty. The court sentenced him to a life term with the appropriate minimum term under UK jurisprudence. Ryland Headley was arrested while in his 90s, standing trial for the crime more than half a century after it was committed. There was no prior prosecution in Louisa's case. Headley had not been suspected publicly until the forensic breakthrough. No exoneration or release applies. The conviction stands as a final closure for this case. The legal status is now closed, convicted. Publicly available court documents and press coverage present motive as opportunistic violence targeting an elderly woman, with underlying sexual intent and forced entry. The prosecution argued that Headley exploited her vulnerable status, entered through the window, committed assault, then strangled her to silence. Because so many years had passed, motive was pieced together from circumstantial evidence, behavioral profiling, and the forensic correlations. While the full narrative of motive, why Louisa was chosen, what triggered the attack, remains partially speculative. The court accepted that Headley's proximity, the matching DNA and fingerprint evidence sustained the case beyond reasonable doubt. For nearly 6 decades, Louisa's descendants, neighbors, and community lived with that dark question. Who took her life? In the years after the conviction, Avon and Somerset police chiefs praised the perseverance of their cold case divisions, acknowledging decades of resource constraints, retiring detectives, and technological gaps. Investigators publicly spoke of the power of preserving old evidence and the virtue of never giving up. Case 8. Michael Sidney Hill. Died 2013. Identified 2025. Arizona, USA, UK citizen. It began in the burning Arizona heat, 2013. A remote corner of the desert, the kind of place few people venture without purpose. A set of human remains was discovered, skeletal, scattered, left to time and dust. The man had no ID, no wallet, no known residence. No one was looking for him in the United States, and no missing persons reports matched his physical profile. With no name, he was entered into local and national databases as a John Doe. Authorities knew only this: he had been someone once. Now, he was a mystery. For a decade, the case sat dormant. Investigators tried all the traditional avenues. Anthropologists estimated his age range based on bone structure, likely between 50 and 70. Forensic dentists noted fillings and tooth loss, but found no match in dental archives. Fingerprints were taken, though desiccated skin made capture unreliable, and submitted to federal and state databases. Nothing. No hits. Facial reconstruction artists attempted a digital image, circulated through missing persons networks, but no family ever came forward. Some speculated he was an undocumented migrant. Others believed he may have been a recluse, possibly homeless, someone estranged from family. But there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of a struggle or clear cause of death. Just the remains of a man the desert had claimed. Without more leads, the case quietly joined hundreds of unidentified bodies in the Southwest, men and women whose lives had ended far from the places they called home. But unlike others, this case would not stay buried. In 2025, 12 years after the body was found, a ripple began forming far from Arizona, in New Jersey. At Ramapo College of New Jersey, a pioneering investigative genetic genealogy, IGG, center had been making international waves. Their mission was straightforward: to use cutting-edge DNA analysis and public genealogy resources to solve the world's forgotten mysteries. When the Arizona ME's office reached out for help, the center accepted the challenge. They had cracked harder cases, and something about this one, this John Doe with no origin, piqued their curiosity. Technicians carefully extracted a DNA sample from the preserved remains, this time using next-generation sequencing, which allows even highly degraded samples to be decoded. The results produced a viable SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism profile, a genetic fingerprint that could be uploaded to public genetic genealogy platforms. GD-Match, Family Tree DNA. Then they waited. Soon, faint connections emerged. A distant match, a third cousin, based in England, another in Wales. The matches weren't strong enough to give a name, but the IgG team, led by genealogist advisors and cross-border liaisons, began to build a tree. They cross-referenced birth and death records, immigration files, and public census documents. Every clue narrowed the possibilities. They traced one line to the town of Crawley in West Sussex, another to Manchester. These routes led them to an extended family, still alive, who had not heard from a relative in decades. The team reached out with care. The cousins they contacted had vague memories of a family member, Michael Sidney Hill, who had left England many years ago. He had always been the private one, the traveler. He was born in the early 1950s, served in various jobs across Europe, then seemingly vanished from the family radar sometime in the early 2000s. None of them knew where he had gone. Some thought he had moved to Canada. Others believed he had simply cut off contact, possibly due to mental illness or a desire for solitude. Once they agreed to submit their DNA, the answers came quickly. The results aligned perfectly. Autosomal tests confirmed the genetic relationship with a margin of error too small to ignore. In early 2025, Ramapo College contacted Arizona authorities with the news. Their John Doe was no longer unknown. He was a British citizen, Michael Sidney Hill. The case made headlines in the IgG community and beyond. For the first time, a British national had been identified through forensic genealogy in a U.S. case. Cold case enthusiasts, investigators, and advocates hailed it as a landmark moment in international cooperation. The UK's National Crime Agency was looped in, and UK-based databases were updated. Michael's name was added to international death indexes, and his family was notified. Yet even as the identity was confirmed, many questions remained. How had Michael ended up in Arizona? Why had he died alone, in the desert, with no record of travel or connection? What had he been doing in the United States? The cause of death was still inconclusive. While no overt trauma was noted in the skeletal remains, the possibility of dehydration, exposure, or a medical episode remained. Toxicology was impossible after so much time. So was the determination of foul play. The case, while now technically closed in terms of identification, reopened in another way. With Michael's name now attached, Arizona authorities re-examined the case from scratch. Investigators sought to trace his final days. Airline records, border crossings, passport usage. None revealed a clear entry into the United States. His name appeared in no visa logs, no accommodation receipts. He had not been in contact with U.S. law enforcement or health services. For all intents and purposes, Michael Sidney Hill had arrived in the country like a ghost and died the same way. Family members traveled to the U.S. to visit the location where his remains had been discovered. There was no grave, no memorial, just a marker at the county coroner's field. But now they had answers. They could reclaim his remains, cremate or bury them as they chose, and, most importantly, bring closure to a silence that had lasted more than a decade. Case 9. Mary Silvani, Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, 1982, Nevada, USA, July 17, 1982. On a quiet summer morning near Lake Tahoe, in a remote clearing known as Sheep's Flat in Washoe County, Nevada, a woman's body was found lying in the tall grass. She had no identification. No one had reported her missing. Her body showed signs of violent assault, sexual and physical, and she had been shot. Over her face and upper body, a pair of men's underwear had been placed, almost as if to hide her in death the way someone had tried to erase her in life. The investigators had little to work with. Her fingerprints didn't match anything in the system. Her dental records led nowhere. No missing person case matched her appearance, and the DNA technology of the time couldn't begin to unravel who she was. So she was buried nameless, remembered only as Sheep's Flat Jane Doe. And for the next 37 years, that's all she remained. But this wasn't just the story of a victim buried under a false name. It was also the story of a killer hiding in plain sight, whose crimes stretched across state lines, and whose final act would be to deny justice by taking his own life. This was the kind of case investigators never forget. They just wait for the day when science catches up to what they always hoped to prove. Back in 1982, the case was handled by the Washoe County Sheriff's Office. Detectives collected clothing, swabbed for trace evidence, and worked through all possible leads. But everything hit a wall. The fingerprints came back with no hits. Dental comparisons, which were often used in that era to connect victims with missing person reports, were cross-referenced with national databases, but there was nothing. No family had reported a woman matching her description missing. No leads turned up from the surrounding states. Her body was buried under a temporary marker, while law enforcement stored her bones, her clothes, and a few samples in cold storage. For decades, the case remained in limbo. Officers retired, new detectives were assigned, and quickly moved on to newer cases with fresher leads. As time passed, the forensic samples collected in 1982 degraded. The bones yielded degraded DNA, too partial and broken to create a full profile. And with no identity for the woman, there was no way to even begin understanding who might have killed her. But in 2018, a new path opened up, one that didn't exist in 1982. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit team of volunteer genealogists who specialized in re-identifying cold case victims. Using single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP sequencing, the team extracted enough DNA from the preserved bones to begin a genealogical search. The breakthrough came when they uploaded the profile to public genetic databases. Not long after, they found several close matches, second and third cousins mostly, all scattered across the Midwest. The genealogists, working backward from these matches, began constructing a family tree. Branch by branch, they eliminated possibilities. And then one name stood out: Mary Edith Silvani, a woman born in Michigan who had gone missing in the late 1970s or early 1980s, but had never been reported as missing. With that match, Jane Doe finally had a name: Mary Edith Silvani. She had lived in Detroit for most of her life. Family members recalled that she had struggled with life as a single woman, moving between jobs, sometimes living out of state. But no one had ever reported her missing, and by the time they considered it, years had passed. The team confirmed the identity using advanced autosomal DNA matching. But this wasn't the end of the story. Now that they knew who the victim was, investigators had something to compare the killer's DNA against. You see, even though the DNA extracted from Mary's body had been degraded, there was another piece of evidence, preserved and mostly overlooked for years: a semen sample from the rape kit. Using new forensic techniques, that sample was reprocessed, sequenced, and run through national DNA databases. It came back with a hit: a man named James Richard Curry. Curry wasn't a new name to law enforcement. He had already been convicted of multiple murders in the early 1980s. In fact, just a year after Mary Silvani was killed, Curry had been arrested for a string of violent crimes. While in custody, before he could face trial for all the charges, he took his own life in jail. At the time, investigators had no idea he was connected to the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe. There was no way to make the connection. But now, decades later, the reanalyzed DNA confirmed it beyond doubt. James Richard Curry had raped and killed Mary Silvani in July of 1982. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, arrested for other crimes, even known as a serial offender. But his worst crime had gone unknown: his victim buried without a name. With both identities now confirmed, Mary Silvani as the victim and James Curry as the perpetrator, the Washoe County Sheriff's Office closed the case. They issued a public statement calling the resolution a landmark breakthrough in cold case history, as it was one of the first times both victim and killer had been identified solely through genealogical DNA. Mary's surviving family members were contacted. Some of them had assumed she had just disappeared by choice, fallen out of touch, moved, started a new life. Others had feared the worst but never had a chance to report her missing. When they were told what had happened, the news was overwhelming. There was grief, yes, but also relief. Relief that she hadn't just vanished without trace. Relief that the truth, as hard as it was to hear, had finally come to light. The community responded with similar mixed emotions. Cold case volunteers, investigators, and forensic experts hailed it as a triumph of science and persistence. A case that had gathered dust for nearly 40 years had finally found its ending. But it also raised difficult questions. How many more Mary Sylvanus were still buried without names? How many more James Currys had gotten away with murder because the science wasn't ready at the time? In the broader criminal justice community, this case sparked conversations about the future of forensic work. Genealogical DNA, once seen as an experiment, had proven itself again. With proper preservation, evidence could speak, no matter how much time had passed. But that preservation required funding, dedication, time, and above all, patience. For the Washoe County Sheriff's Office, this wasn't just another closed file. It was a call to action, a reminder that every case, no matter how cold, still had the potential to be solved, that every nameless victim had a story, that someone, somewhere, still remembered. And sometimes, that someone is science itself. As for Mary, her grave was updated, her name returned, her life acknowledged. And though justice may have come too late for prosecution, it didn't come too late for truth. She had been forgotten for nearly 4 decades. Now, she was forgotten no more. Case 10. Marysville, Jennifer Brinkman, 1998, Marysville, Washington, USA. March 21st, 1998. Marysville, Washington. In a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors rarely locked their doors, the body of 19-year-old Jennifer Brinkman was found in her bedroom. Her father and his girlfriend had just returned from a weekend trip. They expected to see their daughter, maybe hear about how her weekend went. Instead, they walked into a scene that would remain unsolved for more than 2 decades. A brutal murder carried out with a wooden-handled axe left lying near her bed. Jennifer had been struck multiple times, the wounds to her neck and upper body indicating forceful blows. There was no sign of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no screaming neighbors, just silence. Investigators were stunned by the savagery and the stillness of the crime scene. Jennifer's body had likely been there for several days before she was discovered. The axe appeared to have come from the house, suggesting the killer hadn't brought a weapon, but instead used what was available. That detail, so ordinary, so chilling, haunted detectives. This wasn't a random break-in. Whoever did this knew where she lived, maybe even knew she'd be home alone. The Marysville Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation. The first steps were textbook: secure the scene, document the evidence, collect biological samples, swab the axe handle, photograph everything. Early DNA testing was conducted, but the technology in 1998 couldn't make much of the limited biological material. They did find DNA on the murder weapon, but it didn't match anyone in the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. With no known matches, leads fizzled out quickly. Detectives interviewed friends, reviewed Jennifer's phone logs, spoke with neighbors. Nothing stuck. The case began to cool, then freeze. The years wore on. Jennifer's parents moved. Detectives retired. But her case remained. The wooden-handled axe, the very one used to end her life, was preserved. DNA swabs, crime scene photographs, Jennifer's social contacts, all stored away, waiting for something new. For a while, there was hope that one day CODIS might produce a match. But as more years passed and no new information surfaced, Jennifer Brinkman became another name on the cold case list. What stalled the case wasn't neglect, it was limitation. The DNA recovered was never degraded, it just didn't belong to anyone in the system. Back then, police relied on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, and matches from convicted felons. But what if the killer hadn't been arrested? What if he'd lived a quiet life, never giving law enforcement a reason to suspect him? The answer came in 2022. It was November when the Marysville Police Department, with assistance from the Washington State Attorney General's office, made the announcement. After nearly 25 years, they had arrested a suspect in Jennifer's murder. His name, Jeffrey Paul Primo, a 52-year-old man living in Renton. He wasn't on anyone's radar in 1998. There was no known relationship between him and Jennifer, no obvious motive. So how did they find him? Not through CODIS, through genetic genealogy. The process had quietly begun months earlier. Advances in forensic science made it possible to re-extract DNA from preserved materials with a level of sensitivity unheard of in the late 90s. The DNA on the axe was reanalyzed, and this time it was fed not into a government criminal database, but into a public genealogical one. From there, it didn't take long. Distant relatives appeared in the data. Experts built out family trees. They looked for men who would have been in Washington in 1998, men of a certain age, proximity, and biological fit. The branches narrowed. Eventually, one name remained: Primo. Detectives didn't move right away. They cross-referenced addresses, past employment, and communications. In a surprising twist, they discovered that Jennifer may have communicated with Primo through a telephone chat line, popular in the 90s, when internet dating hadn't yet taken over. He may have used an alias or a first name only, but it was enough to establish potential contact. He knew of her, possibly spoke to her. That alone raised flags. Authorities took a fresh DNA sample from Primo to confirm the match, and it did. The sample matched the DNA left on the axe with no room for doubt. After confirming the science, they made their move. On November 28, 2022, officers arrested him at his home. He was charged with first-degree murder and booked into Snohomish County Jail. The community, long haunted by Jennifer's unsolved death, took a collective breath. But it wasn't over. Within days, Primo posted a $250,000 bond and walked free. His trial is pending, and while the state has confidence in the DNA evidence, there's still more to uncover. Prosecutors have not revealed the full set of forensic findings. Questions remain about motive, about what truly brought Primo into Jennifer's world, and what caused that weekend to end in violence. Was it premeditated? Was it a meeting gone wrong? Did Jennifer let him in, believing he was someone she'd spoken to before? These are the questions a jury may one day confront. But for the Brinkman family, the arrest alone represented the end of a long, cruel limbo. Detective Rob Lamoureux, who worked on the case in its early days, publicly acknowledged the efforts of the entire department in keeping the case alive. The evidence had been preserved with care, he said, not just the physical pieces, but the commitment to solving Jennifer's murder. It was that diligence, combined with the miracle of modern DNA science, that brought them to this moment. Marysville Police Chief Eric Scarpon echoed those sentiments in a public statement. He emphasized that the department never gave up. Cold cases aren't forgotten, he said. They're just waiting for the world to catch up to them. That day had finally come. The Washington State Attorney General's office also released a statement, citing Jennifer's case as proof that forensic genetic genealogy could breathe life into even the coldest of cases. Their message was clear. No matter how long it takes, no matter how much time passes, justice can still be served. But the process of justice is slow. As of now, Primo maintains his innocence. No confession has been reported. No further suspects have been named. And while the evidence may be strong, the outcome remains in the hands of the courts. The family is preparing for a trial they've waited 24 years to see. Jennifer Brinkman was more than a cold case file. She was a daughter, a young woman just starting her life. She liked writing. She loved animals. She had plans. Those plans ended in silence, in a locked room, with an axe no one saw coming. In documentaries, we often look for patterns, stories with arcs, clues, closure. But real-life murder doesn't follow scripts. Sometimes it leaves behind only questions and bloodstains. Sometimes the answers don't come until decades later. And even then, they don't bring peace. They just end the silence. Jennifer's case is now reopened with momentum. Her name has been restored in public memory, no longer just a victim, but a symbol of what determination and science can do. She waited 24 years in silence. Now, the world is finally listening. Thank you for standing with us on this journey. Every view, comment, and share helps us honor victims and keep their voices alive. If you'd like to support even more, consider joining our YouTube membership. You'll get exclusive perks, access to premium content, and, most importantly, you'll help us keep telling stories that should never be forgotten. Case 11. Minerliz Minnie Soriano, 1999, Bronx, New York, USA, February 28, 1999. The Bronx. A city already hardened by decades of crime would awaken to a story that would leave even the toughest officers shaken. 13-year-old Minerliz Soriano, known lovingly to friends and family as Minnie, was found strangled and discarded like trash in a garbage dumpster behind a Co-op City building. Her death was not just brutal, it was personal, haunting, and unresolved for more than 2 decades. The initial investigation was swift, but frustrating. NYPD's homicide squad canvassed the area, questioned neighbors, family, teachers. Detectives processed the crime scene, noting the care taken to bind the body, to conceal the evidence, to silence a life. But despite the preserved DNA, the case went cold. The sample was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, but there were no hits. Whoever did this wasn't in the system, not then. And as the years stretched, so did the silence. Technologies changed, forensics evolved. But cases like Minnie's, where the evidence was old, the trail was cold, and the victim was young, lingered in the archives. NYPD kept her file open, but by 2019 it had been 20 years. Then something shifted. The same DNA, stored since 1999, was reprocessed with newer techniques. And this time, it didn't give them a direct hit, but it gave them a clue. A familial DNA match. The sample shared genetic similarities with someone who had once been in the system, the suspect's deceased father. That revelation changed everything. Investigators brought in genealogists. Family trees were built. Each branch narrowed the list. Autosomal markers, generations deep, pointed them to one name: Joseph Martinez. Known in local circles as Jupiter Joe, Martinez was not some faceless drifter. He was a neighborhood figure, someone who taught kids about astronomy on the sidewalks. But beneath that persona, the science suggested, lay something much darker. NYPD detectives collected a fresh sample of Martinez's DNA. Discreetly, quietly, legally. When the lab results came back, it was over. The match to the semen stain on Minnie's sweatshirt was absolute. Authorities moved quickly. In November 2021, Joseph Martinez was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. He didn't run. He didn't confess. He didn't say anything at all. The community was stunned. How could someone so seemingly harmless, a man who spent weekends showing constellations to children, be accused of such a monstrous act? But to investigators, it wasn't about perception. It was about the science. The DNA didn't lie, and the profile from 1999 to 2021 hadn't changed. It had just taken the world that long to catch up. Still, questions remained. Why Minnie? Was she targeted? Was it random? Did he know her? Had there been other victims? Investigators said Martinez and Minnie may have spoken via public chat lines, a common thing in the 1990s, but there was no confirmed relationship, no smoking gun motive, just a trail of genetics that had waited patiently for justice. Martinez's arrest marked one of the most high-profile uses of familial DNA in New York City history. Unlike traditional DNA matches, familial DNA doesn't give you a person, it gives you a family. From there, detectives must use process of elimination, cross-referencing, and old-school legwork to zero in on a suspect. And in this case, it worked. But the path to that moment had been anything but smooth. For 22 years, the case sat dormant. There were no tips, no leads. Every few years, the file would be reopened. Officers would interview someone new, revisit an old lead, pull up archived phone logs. But it was like chasing a ghost in the wind. The only consistent clue remained the DNA, silent, frozen in time, waiting for science to catch up. Minnie's parents had endured countless false hopes. They had watched other families bury their daughters and at least have the solace of knowing who was responsible, not them. The murder of a child never leaves. It becomes a second life sentence for the parents. And theirs was one of silence, of anniversaries unmarked by justice, of birthdays celebrated in memory. In 2020, the NYPD Cold Case Unit took another shot. This time, they brought in genealogical experts who had worked on other landmark cases. The goal was to use the available DNA to not just search for a name, but to build a family tree backward until one viable candidate remained. It was tedious work. Hours of public records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. Then came the turning point. A partial match to the deceased father of Martinez. That single clue cracked the door open. Investigators used census records and voter rolls to map out the surviving male relatives. Martinez stood out, not just by proximity, but by opportunity. He had lived near Co-op City. He had access. He had the ability. Still, science had to seal it. They surveilled Martinez until they could collect a discarded item, a coffee cup, a napkin, anything with his saliva. Once tested, the lab confirmed it. It was the same DNA left on Minnie's clothing. He was arrested without incident. The man who had spoken to school kids about Saturn's rings now sat in handcuffs, accused of a crime that had haunted the Bronx for over 2 decades. There was no press conference filled with bravado, no victory lap by law enforcement, just a quiet statement, a photograph, and a renewed grief for a family that had waited too long. His arraignment was brief. He entered no plea. His eyes never left the floor. And what of motive? That remains elusive. Some believe Minnie was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others believe there was more to their interaction than has been disclosed. What's certain is this: the brutality of the crime, the sexual nature of the assault, and the effort to hide the body pointed to someone who knew how to take a life and walk away without being seen. Someone who thought he'd gotten away with it, until DNA came knocking. As the case now winds through the courts, the Soriano family waits again, this time for a conviction. Closure, if such a thing exists. For the Bronx community, the arrest of Martinez was both a relief and a reckoning. It reminded them that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it carries a telescope and a smile. In the aftermath, city officials praised the persistent work of the cold case team. They credited science, determination, and patience. But no one celebrated, because at the heart of it all was a girl, 13 years old, full of light, silenced before she ever got to live. Minnie Soriano was not forgotten. And now, neither will the man who stole her life. Case 12. Maria Weidhofer, Berkeley, 1990, California, USA. Maria Weidhofer wasn't supposed to become a mystery. She was a vibrant woman, rooted in the rhythm of Berkeley, California, a city known for protest signs, bookstores, and quiet liberal defiance. But on a day in 1990, that quiet was broken. Maria was found murdered, and what followed was not just tragedy, it was silence. For over 3 decades, her killer had a name, a face, and a life, while Maria's memory sat unsolved in a cold case file. Until 2025. The story begins in Berkeley, a city that has always carried a pulse of activism and intellectual energy. But in 1990, that same city became the backdrop for one of its darkest unsolved cases. Maria Weidhofer was found dead under circumstances that shocked the local community. Law enforcement collected blood and traced DNA at the scene, but no suspect was ever arrested. There were no clear leads, no witnesses brave enough or close enough to identify the killer. And in the years that followed, the city moved on. But the case didn't. In the early years, the investigation was handled by the Berkeley Police Department in collaboration with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Detectives did what they could at the time. They canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed potential witnesses, and tested the limits of 1990s forensics. The crime scene yielded DNA, but databases then were rudimentary. CODIS was in its infancy, and genealogical tracing, still science fiction. There were no breaks. The name Maria Weidhofer stayed in the records, but the spotlight moved on. Case files aged like paper in the sun, becoming brittle with time and bureaucracy. Yet, even without active headlines or pressure from the public, the preserved DNA evidence remained intact, sealed in evidence bags, filed away, and waiting for a future that might care more about the past. Years turned into decades. And with each year that passed, the likelihood of justice seemed to fade. Police budgets shrank, cold cases stacked up, and officers who once touched the file transferred, retired, or died. Still, Maria's family waited, unsure whether they would ever see resolution. The pain of not knowing was compounded by the obscurity of the crime. There were no updates, no press conferences, no fresh interviews, just a wound in time that refused to heal. Then came a shift, not in Berkeley, but in the broader world of criminal justice. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, genetic genealogy emerged not just as a curiosity, but as a revolution. After the capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018, law enforcement across the country began to see what was possible when DNA was paired with family trees. Cold case detectives, previously demoralized by lack of leads, were handed a new tool and hope. In 2024, the Berkeley Police Department, in coordination with forensic scientists, decided to revisit the evidence in Maria Weidhofer's case. The preserved DNA was resubmitted, this time not to be matched against known offenders, but to trace the unknown. Single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP profiling, was applied, allowing genealogists to triangulate relationships between the crime scene DNA and public genetic databases. It was slow at first, but the algorithms worked. Family trees began to take shape, branches reaching out from a few shared centimorgans of DNA to full second cousins, and then closer. Eventually, the trail narrowed to a name: John Lipari. Lipari was no stranger to the Bay Area. Born and raised in California, he had a long but quiet life, managing to fly under the radar for decades. There was no glaring arrest record, no flashy profile. He wasn't a serial offender, at least not one known to police. But genealogical mapping doesn't care about how quiet someone's life appears on paper. DNA, after all, is louder than words. Berkeley police began to dig deeper. They obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from Lipari. It matched, conclusively. The sample tied him to the DNA found at the original crime scene in 1990. It was the link no one had been able to find before. Quietly, methodically, a killer had been revealed. In February 2025, John Lipari was arrested. The press release came from the Berkeley Police Department and was confirmed by outlets such as the Berkeley Scanner. After 35 years of mystery, they finally had a name to pair with Maria's case file. Lipari was charged, and for the first time in decades, the phrase "ongoing investigation" had substance. But many questions remained unanswered. Why did he do it? Had he known Maria? Was this a crime of opportunity, of impulse, or something more methodical? As of the latest updates, the motive remained unclear. Authorities have not released detailed information regarding Lipari's connection to Maria or the exact circumstances of her death. The arrest affidavit remains sealed. The community, while grateful for the resolution, is left with fragments, pieces of a puzzle that may never fully connect. Maria's family issued a brief statement. It wasn't filled with rage or long speeches. It was quiet, like the years they had endured. They said they were grateful that someone somewhere had kept the case alive, grateful that their daughter's name was not forgotten, that justice, even delayed, had finally come. Case 13. The 1972 murder of Nancy Anderson, Honolulu, Hawaii, Boulder, Colorado. In 1971, Nancy Anderson left her family home in Colorado, full of hope and curiosity, and moved to Waikiki, Hawaii. She was just 19. Her plan wasn't detailed. Like many girls her age, she was exploring life. A short break before she figured out her future. But, less than a year later, her journey ended in unimaginable violence. On January 7, 1972, Nancy's roommate walked into their shared Waikiki apartment and found her body on the floor. Nancy had been stabbed 63 times. No one had heard screams. No signs of forced entry. Just a blood-soaked towel and the quiet stillness of a life taken far too early. In that moment, the island paradise was shattered. And for the Anderson family, more than 3,000 miles away in Colorado, the nightmare had only begun. The Honolulu Police Department responded swiftly. This wasn't a robbery. There were no signs of sexual assault. But the brutality, the sheer number of wounds, suggested rage, possibly personal. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and ex-boyfriends. They looked into former co-workers and questioned door-to-door salesmen who had been seen in the area that day. But nothing fit. A bloody towel recovered at the scene was preserved, sealed away in evidence. DNA testing wasn't a forensic tool yet, and time would prove merciless. Leads went cold. Files collected dust. Detectives retired. The case would become the oldest unsolved murder in Hawaii's history. In Boulder, Nancy's family was devastated. Her older brother, Jack Anderson, recalled the disbelief. His little sister had just moved out to start her life. She wanted to see the world, he once told reporters. She wanted to be someone. But instead of college applications or future weddings, they got silence. Weeks turned to years, years into decades. Still no answers. Her case faded from headlines, but it never faded from memory. For more than 5 decades, Nancy's parents, then Jack and other surviving family members, kept asking, who could have done this? By the early 2000s, new forensic technology gave families of cold case victims across the country reason to hope. But in Nancy's case, the preserved evidence wasn't enough. The blood sample on the towel, while viable, was partial and degraded. Initial entries into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, yielded no hits. It sat dormant. The towel remained sealed and hopeful. Still, Jack Anderson refused to let it end that way. In 2021, he contacted the Honolulu Police Department once more, this time asking for help from outside agencies that used the latest in forensic genealogy. It was a long shot, but that long shot cracked the case. Investigators reached out to renowned genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, known for helping law enforcement identify suspects in long cold cases. Using the DNA from the towel, Moore ran a profile through open-source genealogical databases. Within months, she had a likely lead. Not a direct match, but a close relative. From there, Moore began the delicate process of building a family tree. One name kept surfacing: Tudor Chirilla. At the time of the murder, Chirilla had been a graduate assistant at the University of Hawaii. He would later go on to become a lawyer and even serve as a deputy attorney general in Nevada, a powerful man with no known criminal record. His life had taken him far from the scene of the crime, but the science wasn't wrong. Still, science alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample. In 2022, Honolulu police secured a warrant to collect Chirilla's DNA. He was living in Reno, Nevada by then, an elderly man in his late 70s. When the results came back, the match was clear. The blood on the towel from 1972 belonged to Tudor Chirilla. He was arrested shortly after and extradited to Hawaii. He pled not guilty to the charge of second-degree murder. For the Anderson family, it felt like a bittersweet victory.
Even though he wasn't found guilty in a court of law, he's found guilty in our hearts.
After 50 years, they finally had a name, but justice still felt uncertain. Jack Anderson, who had spent his entire adult life chasing answers, didn't celebrate. "It's not about revenge," he said. "It's about knowing what happened." The legal process moved slowly. Chirilla, elderly and ailing, was held at the Oahu Community Correctional Center while awaiting trial. But he would never make it to court. On December 25, 2023, Christmas Day, he died in custody. Cause of death was reported as natural. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no verdict. Still, for Nancy's family, this was closure. Imperfect, yes, but final. Jack later said, "I wish he had stood trial. I wish we had answers to the why. But I take peace in knowing he spent the last part of his life in a cell." To honor Nancy's life, Jack wrote a book titled The Brittle Riddle, chronicling his sister's murder, the decades of silence, and the final breakthrough. All proceeds go to DNAjustice.org, a nonprofit helping other families afford the rising cost of forensic testing. "This wasn't just about our family," Jack said. "It was about every family still waiting." In November 2024, the Andersons presented a poster of Nancy and a copy of the book to the Honolulu Police Department. Officers who had never even been born when Nancy was killed stood in silence, honoring a victim they had never met but never forgot. The story of Nancy Anderson is not just a cold case solved. It's a reminder of what time can bury and what science and persistence can unearth. Case 14, The Ford Murders, Bloodlines, Betrayal, and DNA Truth. The quiet of a South Carolina evening was shattered on August 18, 2018. In Conway, Horry County, a burning Ford Escape on Cook's Circle was discovered. Investigators found 3 cigarette butts and scorched fabric inside. A short drive away, in the yard of a modest home on Highway 19, father and son lay dead. Robert Marion Ford, Jr., 59, and his son Robbie Stetson Ford, 25, had been executed. When deputies arrived, the scene was grim. Both Robert and Robbie lay in the yard near the house, shot dead. Nearby, the abandoned and burning SUV raised alarm. That vehicle, tied to Robert, became a key crime scene. Investigators collected shell casings, footprints, tire tracks, and the charred remnants of materials inside the car, including a skull cap and evidentiary cigarette butts. From the outset, law enforcement treated this as a homicide with intent. The scene told of planning, of masking tracks. But lacking witnesses, identifying suspects became a steep climb. The Horry County Sheriff's Office launched the case. Detectives canvassed neighbors, traced cell tower pings, subpoenaed phone and financial records, and interviewed people in the Ford circle: acquaintances, business contacts, estranged family. Forensic teams processed the SUV and crime scene, extracting DNA from cigarette butts and the skull cap, developing profiles. Yet when those DNA profiles were run through state and national databases, no match emerged. Over the months, no suspect was publicly named. Leads surfaced and dimmed, rumors of financial disputes, of jealousy, of inheritance, yet none held up under scrutiny. As the months rolled into years, investigators routinely revisited the case, but nothing clicked. The file became part of the archive of tragedies waiting to be solved. For years, the DNA evidence lingered unused beyond databases. But in the 2020s, forensic genealogy began to claim victories across the country. Horry County, like others, took note. The preserved DNA evidence from the Ford case was submitted to Othram, who partnered with DNA Solves to reanalyze it under modern SNP-based profiling. That DNA didn't return a direct match, but did return clues: relatives, branches, possible lines. A team of genealogists built pedigree charts, eliminating branches until a narrow set of likely candidates remained. One name that repeatedly emerged was Randy Dean Granger, of nearby Loris, South Carolina. Genealogical triangulation, kinship coefficients, and known addresses all pointed toward him. Investigators then obtained a reference sample from Granger, either via court order or discreet collection, and matched it. The DNA from Granger matched the crime scene cigarette butts and skull cap. With strong statistical probabilities and collateral evidence, law enforcement secured an arrest. Simultaneously, other persons of interest emerged in that genealogical tree. Samantha Rabin, daughter of Robert Ford, and Teresa Ann Martin. It appeared Rabin had orchestrated the plot. Martin had acted as a driver or facilitator. Law enforcement traced communication, payments, and movements in the days before the murders that aligned with the timeline derived in the genealogical mapping. The breakthrough didn't just identify the muscle, it revealed the mind behind it. In August 2020, authorities arrested Randy Dean Granger, charging him with 2 counts of murder, conspiracy, arson for burning the SUV, and weapons charges. Investigators also arrested Samantha Rabin, charging her with hiring the hit. Rabin was alleged to have paid Granger $20,000. Teresa Martin, implicated as a logistical partner, was also charged with accessory after the fact and transport. The case moved to trial in 2023. During the proceedings, prosecutors laid out a chilling narrative: a daughter seeking control and money, and a hired killer executing a grisly plot. Witness testimony placed Raban making payments, contacting Granger, and planning routes. Martin admitted to driving Granger to and from the crime, hoping for immunity. The jury convicted Granger on all counts: murder, conspiracy, arson, weapons. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. Raban was also convicted and received a life sentence. Martin was sentenced to a shorter term for her role as accessory and agreed to testify against Raban and Granger. There were no released defendants, no acquittals. All remain behind bars under the terms of their sentencing. The Ford case is closed in both legal and forensic senses. The motive, as established at trial, was financial gain and control over inheritance. Raban allegedly orchestrated the murders to secure life insurance benefits and access to her father's estate. Granger's role was as contract killer, while Martin provided logistical help. The prosecution argued that Raban's promise of payment, her prior estrangement, and her communication patterns all aligned with the timeline. The premeditation was clear: the burning of the SUV to conceal evidence, the skull cap, the timing, the selection of DNA evidence sources. This was a murder-for-hire scheme wrapped in familial betrayal. The Ford family's grief was intensified by betrayal. In the region of Conway and Horry County, news that a daughter hired a hitman shook local faith. At the sentencing, family members wept. The church, the condolence cards, the memorials, all were a backdrop to a deeper sorrow. That trust had been weaponized. In local media, others voiced relief. The solution proved that even cold, baffling murders could be solved when science and perseverance connect. The Horry County Sheriff praised the collaboration with genealogy units and Othram as a roadmap for other cold cases. Case 15, John Doe 2000, 24-year cold case, Weld County, Colorado, USA. For 24 years, a male's remains, discovered in Weld County, Colorado, went unidentified. This cold case, simply labeled John Doe 2000, remained open until 2023, when forensic genetic genealogy brought answers. In February 2000, skeletal remains of a male were discovered in a rural, secluded area near the Weld County line. The bones were badly decomposed and had clearly been exposed to the elements for an extended period. Law enforcement began a search for clues but had few answers. Early investigative efforts, including attempts to identify the remains via traditional methods like dental records and fingerprints, proved unsuccessful. The identity of the deceased was never confirmed, and for more than 2 decades, the case was left to linger in the cold case files. For years, the man's remains were cataloged simply as John Doe 2000. The investigation became a haunting reminder for the law enforcement community, a case that had gone nowhere, yet still needed answers. Despite the lack of a breakthrough, the Weld County Sheriff's Office preserved the remains. This foresight would later prove invaluable when new techniques, such as DNA analysis, evolved and offered a fresh opportunity for resolution. In the years following the discovery, the investigation into the identity of John Doe 2000 took many twists and turns. The initial efforts involved canvassing the area where the remains were found, hoping that someone might recognize the victim or recall any unusual activity. Several theories about the man's identity were considered: perhaps a local drifter, a victim of an accident, or someone with no family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The Weld County Sheriff's Office, alongside cold case detectives including Detective Byron Castellan, preserved the remains for future analysis. Forensic techniques available at the time, dental and fingerprint comparisons, failed to yield any results. Investigators kept the case open, but without any new leads or technological advancements, the investigation went cold. As time passed, the investigation became a forgotten priority. However, every few years, Detective Castellan revisited the case, re-examining old evidence and looking for any missed connections. But the case continued to haunt him, unanswered and unresolved. For over 2 decades, the case failed to make any headway. Early DNA analysis, attempted in the early 2000s, was inconclusive. The DNA extracted from the remains was either too degraded or incomplete for matching with available databases. The advancements in forensic technology had not yet reached the level necessary to provide answers, and without the ability to apply genetic genealogy, the trail grew cold. At the time, forensic genealogy was not yet a tool used in criminal investigations. Investigators could not have predicted that DNA analysis, which had once been dismissed for its inability to match the remains, would later become the cornerstone for solving this case. The absence of strong leads, compounded by budget constraints and the increasing backlog of cold cases, resulted in this mystery being shelved for years. Each passing year reduced the likelihood of identifying the man, as potential witnesses aged or moved away, and records that might have been helpful disappeared. Yet, despite the mounting frustrations, there was always the underlying hope that one day, technology would provide the answers they needed. In 2022, the Weld County Sheriff's Office, in partnership with private genealogy firm Othram, revisited the case. Othram, known for their work on identifying John and Jane Does across the United States, reprocessed the remains using modern forensic DNA techniques. This time, DNA from the bones was successfully extracted and subjected to the most advanced forensic genealogy methods. Genealogists working with Othram used the DNA profile to search genealogy databases like GEDmatch. In the past, this method would not have been possible, but with the increasing availability of genealogical databases, investigators could trace the man's genetic roots through family connections. By comparing the extracted DNA to genealogical databases, they found distant relatives who pointed to a connection in Nevada. The genealogical analysis led investigators to a potential suspect, Christopher Scott Case. His family tree matched the genetic profile of the remains. In December 2023, after cross-checking the genetic markers and obtaining DNA samples from Case's relatives, authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to Christopher Scott Case, a man whose family had long been unaware of his fate. Christopher Scott Case, the man identified as John Doe 2000, was not involved in any known criminal activity. His death, which had remained a mystery for so many years, was not attributed to a violent crime until this point. There were no charges filed against anyone in connection with Case's death, as he was now identified as a victim, not a perpetrator. The identification of Case marked the closure of a long and difficult investigation. His family, who had long wondered what had happened to him, were finally given the peace of knowing his name and his resting place. For the Weld County Sheriff's Office, this case represented the breakthrough that forensic genealogy could bring to cold cases, an innovative tool that had already brought answers to countless mysteries. Although no new suspects were identified in the case, the fact that Case's identity was finally known brought solace to the investigation team. They could now move forward with their other cold cases, equipped with the knowledge that new technologies could help bring closure to even the most dormant of investigations. The resolution to this case lies not in finding a killer, but in answering the question of identity. It was a question that had plagued the authorities for more than 2 decades. Christopher Scott Case, a man who had vanished into the annals of mystery, had now been restored to his family's history. While the investigation remains officially open, and the cause of his death is presumed to be a homicide, no further details on the manner of his death have been released. The case remains a testament to the power of modern forensic techniques, particularly forensic genealogy. The identification of John Doe 2000 was a landmark moment for Weld County and for cold cases nationwide. Though the case didn't end in a prosecution, it provided an important lesson in persistence and the willingness to embrace new technologies to solve long-standing mysteries. For the Case family, this moment brought them peace and closure after many years of uncertainty. As Detective Castellan noted, the identification of Case marked an important chapter in the story of the case. For all these years, we had wondered. Now we have the answers. Case 16. Maurice Civarella, 1964, Pennsylvania, USA. On March 18, 1964, 9-year-old Maurice Ann Civarella was abducted and murdered in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. In 2022, authorities officially identified the perpetrator via investigative genetic genealogy, making it one of Pennsylvania's oldest solved cold cases. Maurice was a young, innocent girl, full of life, and had a bright future ahead of her. On March 18, 1964, she left her home for her usual walk to school. She never made it to class that day. Instead, her body was discovered later that same day, a short distance from her home. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the Hazleton community, leaving everyone in a state of disbelief and fear. Upon discovering Maurice's body, investigators found evidence that suggested a violent crime had occurred. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and then strangled. The manner of her death was both tragic and brutal. Despite early evidence pointing to a violent crime, investigators had no leads. No suspect, no witness, and no clues emerged to give any direction to the investigation. As the investigation unfolded, local police quickly realized that they had little to go on. Maurice's abduction seemed to have been a random act of violence. Her family was devastated, and the community remained in a constant state of uncertainty as the days, weeks, and months passed. Maurice's case soon became another cold file, with no answers and no closure. The investigation into Maurice's murder was led by the Hazleton Police Department with the assistance of the Pennsylvania State Police. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, hoping to find witnesses or any piece of evidence that could lead them to the perpetrator. They interviewed locals and investigated potential suspects. However, despite their efforts, no significant leads came to light. A forensic examination was conducted, and evidence was collected at the crime scene. A piece of Maurice's clothing, along with DNA evidence, was preserved for future testing. But during the 1960s, DNA testing was not a widely used method for solving crimes. This meant that much of the collected evidence went untested for years. The investigation seemed to stall, and the case was ultimately classified as a cold case. Over the next few decades, Maurice's murder faded from the public eye. However, her family never stopped hoping for justice. Her mother and father clung to the hope that one day, someone would be held accountable for their daughter's brutal death. For many years, they lived with the haunting knowledge that Maurice's killer was still out there, walking free. Despite the evidence that had been preserved over the years, no substantial progress was made. DNA testing was still in its infancy, and methods of forensic analysis were not advanced enough to identify the killer. With no new leads and limited resources, the case went into the cold case files, where it remained for decades. As time passed, the investigation into Maurice's murder became increasingly difficult. Witnesses faded into obscurity, and the trail to the killer grew cold. The DNA collected from the crime scene was never matched to a suspect. For many years, Maurice's case seemed to be one of the many unsolved mysteries that would remain that way, lost to time. The failure to identify the perpetrator during the initial investigation was compounded by several factors. First, the lack of advanced forensic technology prevented investigators from making a breakthrough. The methods used in the 1960s were primitive by today's standards. In addition, with the passage of time, the police force had limited resources to dedicate to older cases like Maurice's. The case was further hindered by a lack of new evidence or witness testimony. But the most significant reason for the failure to solve the case was the lack of available forensic genealogical methods. Investigative genetic genealogy, something that would prove to be crucial in solving the case, was not a practice in the 1960s. As a result, Maurice's killer remained at large for more than 50 years, despite the efforts of law enforcement. In 2022, nearly 6 decades after Maurice's murder, a breakthrough finally came. Advancements in forensic genetic genealogy, specifically the ability to analyze DNA evidence and trace it through family trees, offered investigators a new way to solve cold cases. The DNA from the crime scene, which had been preserved all those years, was finally re-examined. This re-examination, led by the Pennsylvania State Police in collaboration with forensic genealogists, was a turning point in the case. Using investigative genetic genealogy, the team was able to trace the DNA to distant relatives of the perpetrator. Their work narrowed down the list of potential suspects, eventually leading them to James Paul Fort. Fort, a man who had lived in Hazleton around the time of Maurice's murder, was not previously known to law enforcement. He had no prior record of violent crime and had not been a suspect in Maurice's case. However, through genetic genealogy, investigators were able to connect him to the crime scene. Once Fort was identified, authorities obtained a DNA sample from him for confirmatory testing. The DNA match confirmed that Forty was indeed the person responsible for the brutal murder of Maurice Civarella. James Paul Fort was arrested in 2022, nearly 60 years after the murder. He was charged with first-degree murder, and in 2023, he pled guilty to the crime. Fort's arrest was a significant moment for Maurice's family, who had waited so long for justice. However, despite the guilty plea, Fort's arrest raised a complicated range of emotions. For the family, the long-awaited resolution was bittersweet. They had finally achieved the closure they had fought for, but it came so many years after Maurice's tragic death. Forty's arrest was a product of persistence, both from law enforcement and from the new technology that enabled the identification of suspects in cold cases. Although Fort had evaded justice for decades, forensic genetic genealogy allowed investigators to track him down. The case was solved, but it raised questions about the time it took and the methods that could have helped solve it sooner. While it provided closure for Maurice's family, the pain of lost years and the toll of a life lost too soon still lingered. Fort's motive for murdering Maurice Civarella was never fully articulated in the public record. However, the nature of the crime, abduction, sexual assault, and strangulation, indicates a disturbing level of predatory behavior. In his guilty plea, Fort did not offer a clear explanation for why he murdered Maurice, but it is likely that his actions were motivated by an uncontrollable urge to harm. Fort's history of violent behavior is unclear, but the brutality of the crime suggests that he may have been a repeat offender. It is possible that Maurice was simply a victim of opportunity, but the fact that Fort never faced trial means that the full extent of his actions may never be known. For Maurice's family, the resolution of the case was both a relief and a moment of deep sorrow. Maurice's parents, who had lived for decades without knowing who was responsible for their daughter's death, were finally able to bury their pain. The arrest of James Fort allowed them to understand that Maurice's killer had been caught, though the pain of losing their child so young remained. Case 17. Lelia Ann May Malley, 2002, 22-year Doe case, New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. For over 2 decades, Lelia Ann May Malley, a young woman from New Orleans, Louisiana, was nothing more than a mystery, a Jane Doe whose life ended tragically and too soon. Abducted and killed in 2002, her case remained unsolved until 2024. In early 2002, the lifeless body of a young woman was discovered near New Orleans, Louisiana. The remains were skeletal and decomposed, and at first, there was little evidence to suggest her identity. She was found in a desolate area, and no immediate signs linked her to any missing person reports. For years, the young woman's name remained unknown, a grim reminder of the many forgotten cases in cold case files across the nation. But as the years passed, investigators would not let the case slip into the abyss of unaccounted-for deaths. Malley's body was preserved, and in the years that followed, the case was periodically revisited. Her story became one of frustration and hope in equal measure. Law enforcement officers, determined not to forget her, continued their search for answers. The victim's identity, however, was elusive. The unknown woman's body was carefully cataloged by the New Orleans Police Department, and a series of forensic analyses, including dental and skeletal examinations, were conducted. Forensic artists even attempted 3D reconstructions of the woman's face based on the skeletal remains. Yet the face of the woman remained a mystery. The investigation hit dead ends. No leads, no matches, and no witnesses came forward. Despite the years that passed, hope for resolution never waned. The NOPD, along with federal and state officials, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, awaiting the advancement of forensic techniques that might finally bring answers. Every lead, every possibility was revisited, but with each passing year, the trail grew colder. The NOPD led the investigation into the unknown woman's death, initially handling the case with standard forensic methods. A core team of investigators, including those from the Cold Case Division, diligently pursued the investigation with limited resources. Their initial work involved cross-referencing missing persons databases, using skeletal remains for age and ethnic origin estimations, and consulting with forensic specialists who could help identify potential causes of death. Over the years, different methods were applied to try to break the case, but each attempt to identify the victim failed. At the time, genetic testing was in its infancy, and DNA analysis wasn't the powerhouse tool it is today. There were no hits in databases like CODIS, and investigative leads were sparse. The young woman's identity, as well as the full circumstances of her death, remained unresolved. Over time, the case became a grim reminder of the limitations law enforcement faced without the tools and technology that would later come to define modern crime solving. Despite this, investigators remained dedicated to bringing closure to the victim's family, even though they didn't know who the family was or where they were. The case stayed in the public consciousness, its chilling uncertainty lingering in the air. As the years turned into decades, the case grew colder, and the frustration of both the investigators and the community grew. In a case as haunting as this one, the questions of who was she and who would do this were always at the forefront of people's minds. Initially, there were many hurdles. The DNA extracted from the victim's remains was too degraded to be usable in CODIS, the FBI's national database. The tools that could match DNA to known criminals simply didn't exist yet. Additionally, due to the victim being a Jane Doe, there was no public record to link her to any missing persons report. The lack of direct evidence and identification meant that this case lingered in the background. Moreover, the case was complicated by the nature of forensic analysis in the early 2000s. The victim's body, which had decomposed over time, had very few viable biological traces, and with few leads, the investigation slowly wound down, becoming one of many unsolved mysteries. As the years passed, investigators had no way of knowing who the victim was or who had committed the crime. But they did have one thing: her remains. And while the case seemed dormant, there remained a hope that modern forensic techniques would one day shine a light on what had happened. In 2024, 2 decades after the initial crime, the New Orleans Police Department, under the leadership of the Cold Case Unit, reopened the case. This time, however, things were different. Advances in forensic genetic genealogy gave them the tools they had previously lacked. These methods were not available when the case had first begun, but by 2024, genealogical DNA testing had become a reliable method for identifying both victims and perpetrators. Using preserved DNA from the victim's remains, the NOPD worked alongside forensic genealogists, who were experts in DNA analysis. They compared the genetic material against public genealogy databases, hoping to trace any possible familial connections. It didn't take long for results to emerge. Investigators soon found distant family members of the victim. They were able to build a genealogical tree, tracing the victim's ancestry and narrowing down potential relatives. This was a significant breakthrough, a moment that signaled that the technology that once seemed out of reach was now available to resolve this long-forgotten mystery. With genealogical methods providing critical leads, the NOPD identified the victim, Lelia Ann May Malley. The identity of the victim was confirmed, but the case didn't end there. Investigators, now knowing who she was, turned their attention to finding the person responsible for her death. With the victim's identity confirmed, the next step was to find out who had killed her. Investigators focused on possible suspects who might have had ties to the victim. Unfortunately, there were no immediate suspects tied to the crime. Over the next few months, investigators revisited the circumstances of the crime and the surrounding area. They searched for anyone who might have known Malley or had any connection to her. But even with these efforts, the investigation hit a roadblock. No new evidence surfaced, and no clear suspects emerged. However, as the years passed, the case garnered attention from both local and national media outlets. The identification of Lelia Ann Malley's remains led to a renewed focus on her case, but the mystery of who had killed her remained unsolved. The case remained unsolved, and there was no clear explanation for Malley's murder. Although forensic testing and genealogical methods had identified the victim, no suspect had been publicly named or arrested. The questions surrounding the cause of her death and the identity of her killer lingered. The lack of clarity surrounding the motive was another issue that left many unanswered questions. While the murder of Lelia Ann Malley was presumed to be a violent and horrific crime, the reasons behind it were unclear. The investigation continued, but the lack of evidence and the age of the case made it difficult to provide definitive answers. The family of Lelia Ann May Malley, although grateful for the identification of their loved one, was left with a sense of sorrow and frustration. After so many years of uncertainty, they finally knew who she was, but the answers they sought about the identity of her killer remained elusive. For the community, Malley's case became a symbol of both hope and heartbreak. The identification of her remains was a triumph for forensic technology and a breakthrough for law enforcement. But the fact that the case had gone unsolved for so many years weighed heavily on those who had hoped for closure. Despite the difficulties, the family expressed a sense of relief, knowing that their loved one had not been forgotten, and while they still yearned for justice, they took comfort in knowing that, at the very least, they had finally uncovered the truth about who she was. Case 18. Kathy Swartz, Catherine Edwards Murders, Texas, USA. Two long-standing cold murders in Texas, the 1988 killing of Kathy Swartz and the 1995 murder of Catherine Edwards, were broken in the 2020s via Othram and genetic genealogy. In 1988, Kathy Swartz, a 29-year-old woman, was found murdered in her home in Texas. The case quickly gained attention, but for over 2 decades, the investigation hit a dead end. In 1995, a similar case surfaced. Catherine Edwards, a 27-year-old teacher in Beaumont, Texas, was found brutally murdered in her own home. Both cases were linked by the brutal nature of the crimes, which included sexual assault and strangulation. Despite early forensic work, including DNA collection and a search of local and national databases, investigators had no solid leads for both murders. For years, both cases languished in the cold case files, each marked by unanswered questions and a sense of frustration for their families. However, both cases remained open. Evidence was preserved, and new forensic techniques were quietly evolving. In the 2020s, a breakthrough came when the local investigators in Texas partnered with Othram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, and began reprocessing the DNA evidence. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in both cases. Both investigations initially involved the Beaumont Police Department and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Detective Rob Lamoureux, the original investigator for the Edwards case, was instrumental in helping push for the cold case to be revisited in the new decade. In Swartz's case, local law enforcement had worked diligently to gather evidence, but the lack of a match in CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, left them with little to go on. Over the years, investigators in both cases painstakingly followed leads, but the DNA evidence from both crime scenes, including semen and traces of blood, failed to provide conclusive results. DNA profiling methods at the time were simply not advanced enough to generate usable profiles from the degraded samples found at the scenes. For both women, the killer had used an incredibly personal and invasive method of murder, which was common in the two cases. But what they both lacked were the vital connections in the database that could have led to the perpetrators. With no leads and limited resources, the cases eventually grew cold, and the memory of the victims faded into the background. For more than 20 years, both of these cases remained unsolved, despite the best efforts of investigators. DNA evidence was preserved, but the lack of genealogical methods meant that no concrete matches were found in CODIS or other national databases. As the years went on, the leads dried up. In Edwards' case, witnesses' memories faded, and the trail of potential suspects became colder. Similarly, in Swartz's case, the absence of witnesses or any tangible suspects pushed the investigation into the cold case files. The forensic advancements that might have made the difference weren't yet fully embraced by law enforcement. At the time, the idea of using genetic genealogy to solve these cases was not even considered. Although forensic DNA analysis was used in both investigations, it lacked the power of modern techniques, such as using genealogy to trace family trees and identify potential suspects. In the early 2020s, a powerful new forensic tool began to take root: forensic genetic genealogy. Othram, a company specializing in genetic genealogy, partnered with law enforcement to reprocess DNA samples from cold cases. This technology uses DNA to trace the family lineage of potential suspects by matching distant relatives in public genealogical databases. For both Kathy Swartz and Catherine Edwards, the breakthrough came after years of stagnation. The team used modern techniques to analyze the preserved DNA and upload it to public genealogical databases such as GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. The power of this method lies in its ability to match familial DNA, allowing investigators to trace family trees back to possible suspects. For Edwards, genealogists identified Clayton Foreman as a potential suspect. Foreman's family connections traced him to high school and social circles that were eerily close to the victim. Further testing of DNA samples confirmed that Foreman was the murderer of Catherine Edwards. For Kathy Swartz, a similar genealogical analysis led investigators to Robert Waters, a man with connections to the area. Waters was linked directly to the crime through fingerprint and DNA matches. However, Waters tragically died by suicide while awaiting trial, leaving his case in an unresolved state. In both cases, genetic genealogy allowed investigators to cross-check family trees, eliminate alternative branches, and ensure the timeline of events was consistent with the suspects' histories. The method was revolutionary in identifying suspects from long-forgotten cases. The arrest in Catherine Edwards' case was a culmination of years of hard work, with Clayton Foreman being taken into custody for the brutal murder of the Beaumont teacher. He was charged and eventually convicted for his crimes. However, in the case of Kathy Swartz, the suspect, Robert Waters, was arrested but died in jail, leaving his trial and the justice process incomplete. The lack of a proper trial for Waters made the resolution bittersweet for Swartz's family, though the breakthrough in identifying him was still a monumental achievement. In both cases, the use of genealogical methods was a game-changer for the police and the families involved, though Swartz's case, in particular, remains unresolved in terms of full legal closure. Both cases were solved due to the application of forensic genetic genealogy. But there are lingering questions, particularly in the Swartz case. While the motive in Edwards' murder was relatively clear, a history of violence linked to Foreman, the motives for Swartz's murder remain less detailed. While there was speculation that Swartz's killer may have had some form of connection to her, this connection remains unclear in the public record. The Swartz case still leaves some unanswered questions regarding the exact nature of the relationship between her and Robert Waters, as well as how he ultimately ended her life. This absence of a trial for Waters has left the family with a sense of relief, but also unfinished business. Both families expressed relief when the killers were identified, but the closure was different for each. The Edwards family was able to witness the justice process firsthand, with Foreman's arrest and conviction providing a sense of closure after decades of pain. The Swartz family, on the other hand, found relief in knowing the truth, but the death of Robert Waters before a trial cast a shadow over their sense of justice. Case 19. Deborah Lee Miller, James Vanist Identification, 1981, Mansfield, Ohio, USA. On April 29, 1981, 18-year-old Deborah Lee Miller was found brutally beaten to death in her apartment in Mansfield, Ohio. Nearly 43 years later, the cold case was solved in December 2024 when DNA evidence linked a former neighbor to the crime just before he died in a police shootout. Despite the violence of the crime, there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, which left investigators puzzled from the start. There were few leads, just a bloody scene and a murder weapon, which was suspected to have been a blunt object, though no definitive weapon was recovered. The investigation quickly picked up, with local police combing through the crime scene for any trace evidence. Blood and DNA swabs were taken, with the hope of eventually matching them to a suspect. But despite these early efforts, the case went cold. The pieces of evidence collected in the early days of the investigation languished in cold case files, waiting for advancements in forensic technology that would eventually lead to a breakthrough. The Mansfield Police Department and Richland County authorities began their work on the case, interviewing neighbors and friends of Miller. They canvassed the area around her apartment complex and began to suspect that Miller's killer was likely someone she knew. Early forensic work focused on the evidence found at the crime scene: bloodstains, potential DNA, and a partial palm print. However, the technology at the time simply wasn't capable of providing the match they so desperately needed. There was no DNA database in 1981, and fingerprint technology, though useful, didn't offer an immediate connection to the murderer. The police investigation slowed in the face of dead-end leads, and as the years passed, the case moved further down the list of priorities. The city of Mansfield, once buzzing with the shock of the crime, began to focus its energy elsewhere. Over the following decades, the case grew colder and colder, and Miller's family was left without answers, their grief unresolved. For many years, the evidence sat dormant in a cold case file. DNA profiling, although in its infancy in the early 80s, was not yet a useful tool in this case. In fact, much of the DNA collected from the crime scene was simply too degraded to be useful. As the years passed, the technology needed to extract meaningful information from the evidence wasn't available, and law enforcement's resources were stretched thin, making it difficult for the case to receive the attention it required. The lack of leads, and the absence of witnesses willing or able to provide new information, meant that the investigation slowly fell apart. Investigators returned to it every so often, but without new leads or technological advances, the case remained unsolved. Without the DNA matching technology that would eventually come to define the resolution of so many cold cases, the investigation stalled and the trail grew cold. But then, forensic science took a monumental leap forward in the 2010s, offering new hope to Miller's case and to her grieving family. Fast forward to 2024. Advances in forensic technology, specifically DNA and genealogical methods, would finally bring closure to a case that had been untouched for over 4 decades. Detective Terry Butler and DNA analyst Dawn Fryback led the charge to re-examine the case's preserved evidence. This was a process of looking at the crime scene with fresh eyes and using cutting-edge techniques to analyze the old evidence. In the 2020s, investigators began using DNA testing methods that weren't available when Miller was murdered. They employed deconvolution techniques to separate mixed samples and build a firm DNA profile from the previously collected evidence. Over 80 distinct DNA analyses were conducted on the evidence items found at the scene, including Miller's blood, potential saliva, and skin cells left behind by the murderer. The advancements in DNA analysis allowed for the reconstruction of an almost complete genetic profile, but the critical moment came when that profile was entered into a genealogical database. That's when the breakthrough came. The DNA matched James Vanist, a former neighbor of Miller's. Vanist, who lived in the same building as Miller, had never been a suspect before. Yet, through the power of forensic genealogy, investigators were able to link him to the murder. The DNA profile matched him not only through his direct relatives, but also through circumstantial evidence. Vanist was someone who had been in the area, knew Miller, and was even questioned early on in the investigation, though no significant evidence was initially found to tie him to the crime. As more of the genealogical puzzle pieces were pieced together, investigators were able to confirm that Vanist was indeed the murderer. The fact that the DNA matched, combined with Vanist's proximity to Miller and his past involvement in the investigation, created a compelling case. However, just as the case was about to come to a head, an unexpected turn of events occurred. In a tragic twist, James Vanist was never arrested for Miller's murder. In December 2024, as law enforcement prepared to make the arrest, Vanist was killed in a police shootout during a separate operation. The confrontation, which involved Vanist attempting to flee from authorities when they came to serve a warrant on unrelated charges, ended with Vanist being shot and killed in a standoff. The timing was almost unbelievable. A case that had remained cold for so long was finally cracked, only for the prime suspect to die before he could face trial. While the community and Miller's family were left to process the loss of the opportunity for justice, there was some solace in knowing that Vanist's involvement had been confirmed, even if he would never stand trial. With Vanist's death, the case was officially closed, and the murder of Deborah Lee Miller was finally solved. Although there was no trial, and no full confession from the perpetrator, the identification of the murderer brought the closure that the family and the community had been waiting for. Forensics, detective work, and persistence had brought justice, albeit posthumously. The exact motive behind Miller's murder remained speculative. Given that Vanest and Miller were neighbors, it's believed that the crime was one of personal violence. While the details of why Vanest killed Miller were not fully released, the brutality of the crime, her beating and strangulation, suggested a violent personal conflict, with some suggesting that there may have been an intimate connection between the two. However, no concrete motive has been made public. Despite this, the case remains a success in the world of forensic science. It is a testament to the advancements made in the field of DNA testing, which have allowed investigators to revisit old, unsolved cases and identify perpetrators long after the crimes were committed. The resolution of the case was bittersweet for Miller's family. While they finally had the answers they had spent years searching for, the fact that Vanest would never face justice in a courtroom was difficult to reconcile. For the family, this case represented decades of waiting, hoping, and grieving. But the identification of the killer was a moment of relief, and the closure they had longed for. Case 20. Donna Oglev, 1998, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. In February 1998, 24-year-old Donna Oglev, a pregnant woman traveling through Toronto, was tragically strangled in a parking lot. For 27 years, her case remained unsolved. The chilling discovery of Donna Oglev's body occurred on a quiet February day in 1998. She was found in a parking lot behind 130 Carlton Street, a place that would forever be tied to tragedy. Strangled to death, Oglev, who was also pregnant, had been left in the cold without an apparent motive, and no witnesses came forward. The city of Toronto, known for its bustling streets and vibrant life, was struck by a dark cloud as a young woman's life was violently extinguished without explanation. When responding officers arrived, the scene was disturbing. Oglev's body lay in the parking lot, and the initial assessment pointed to strangulation as the cause of death. Investigators quickly gathered evidence, including DNA, which was believed to have been left behind by the killer. Despite the forensic evidence at the scene, initial investigations did not lead to any definitive suspects. The DNA profile collected from Oglev's body was submitted to databases, but unfortunately, no matches were found. At the time, DNA profiling was still in its infancy, and the tools available to law enforcement were limited. This would set the stage for a decades-long journey to justice that would ultimately culminate in the groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy. The Toronto Police Service's Homicide and Missing Persons Unit took responsibility for the case, and as the years passed, it was filed under the cold case section. Despite the best efforts of detectives, Oglev's case remained unsolved, with little progress made over the years. The police periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping to uncover a breakthrough, but the case languished in obscurity. As the years turned into decades, the investigation grew colder, and the case was almost forgotten by the general public. However, the Toronto Police Service did not give up. They released periodic appeals for information, including media coverage and even a podcast in the hopes of uncovering new leads. But despite these efforts, no significant tips came forward, and the investigation remained at a standstill. What the authorities had were the preserved biological traces found at the crime scene, a stark reminder of the tragedy, but no viable way to link those traces to a suspect. The lack of accessible genealogical tools in Canada during the early years prevented the use of such revolutionary technology in solving cases like Oglev's. As the years passed, the momentum to solve this case slowed, but the evidence was always there, waiting for a breakthrough. For years, despite having a male DNA profile, investigators were unable to match it with any entries in Canadian or U.S. offender databases. The profile was a clue, but it was useless without a way to connect it to a suspect. The case had faded into the background as the authorities moved on to newer cases, but the memory of Donna Oglev remained in the hearts of her family, who never stopped hoping for justice. The case seemed almost impossible to crack, as the traditional methods available were insufficient for the task. As DNA technology continued to evolve, it became clear that a new approach was needed. However, at the time, genealogical DNA methods had not yet been integrated into the criminal justice system in Canada. As a result, even though the evidence was preserved, it was left dormant, gathering dust in the archives. Without the ability to use familial DNA to track down relatives of the perpetrator, the trail grew colder with each passing year. Yet, even in this silence, a new wave of technology was on the horizon, one that would breathe new life into cold cases like Ogliv's. In the early 2020s, a monumental shift in forensic science would soon change the trajectory of cold cases like Ogliv's. By 2025, Othram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, partnered with the Toronto Police Service to tackle this unsolved case. What had been a long-standing dead end suddenly had new possibilities. Othram's experts utilized the preserved DNA from Ogliv's case and worked tirelessly to build a genetic profile from the crime scene evidence. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to apply genealogical techniques to link Ogliv's DNA profile to relatives of a possible suspect. These advancements in DNA technology, including the use of public genealogy databases, allowed for the creation of a family tree that eventually led investigators to a person of interest, Ronald Ackerman. The process of building a family tree through genetic genealogy is a complex one, as it involves linking the DNA to distant relatives and then using that information to narrow down possible suspects. For the first time in the case, the DNA evidence found at the scene became more than just a clue. It became a key to unlocking the truth. With the identification of Ronald Ackerman as the potential perpetrator, authorities began to dig deeper into his background. Ackerman had ties to Oglive through social circles, and the circumstantial evidence began to paint a clearer picture of the case. After extensive investigation, including DNA testing on Ackerman himself, the results came back with a clear match. Ackerman's DNA was definitively linked to the evidence collected at the crime scene, confirming that he was, in fact, Ogliv's murderer. The long wait for justice was finally over. On the strength of the genetic match, Ronald Ackerman was arrested in 2025. However, despite the arrest, Ackerman's fate was tragically sealed before he could face trial. In the midst of the legal process, Ackerman died during an attempt to arrest him for federal gun charges. The arrest had been made in connection with other charges, but the timing was unfortunate. The case of Ogliv's murder would never go to trial. The family, though relieved to know the truth, was left with a feeling of unfinished business. Ackerman's death before he could stand trial left many with a sense of incompleteness. Nonetheless, the authorities were able to close the case and provide the family with the answers they had been seeking for decades. While the case was officially closed and Ackerman's identity as the perpetrator was confirmed, the specific details of his motive remain somewhat unclear. Investigators have suggested that there was a personal connection between Ackerman and Ogliv, and that the crime was likely a result of violent and predatory behavior. However, the full narrative of why Ackerman targeted Ogliv and what led him to commit such a brutal act has not been fully explored in public statements. Though the arrest and the resolution of the case provided some degree of closure, there are still lingering questions that remain unanswered. As the investigation continues, there may be further developments that shed light on the exact nature of Ackerman's relationship with Ogliv and what exactly led to her tragic death. The resolution of Ogliv's case brought a bittersweet relief to her family and the community. After nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, the truth was finally revealed. The family, devastated by the loss of their loved one, was now able to rest knowing that the killer had been identified and the case had been closed. Case 21, Catherine Davio, 2008, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. In December 2008, 26-year-old Catherine Davio was murdered in her Montreal home. For nearly 17 years, her killer remained unknown. But in September 2025, the Montreal police announced that they had solved her murder. It was a cold December night in Montreal when Catherine Davio, a 26-year-old woman full of life and promise, was found dead in her apartment. The scene was shocking. Her body was discovered in her Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie residence, and it was clear that the cause of death was murder. Early on, police discovered domestic crime scene DNA, likely bodily fluids, which suggested a violent assault, though at the time, investigators did not have enough evidence to make any immediate conclusions. Daviau's life was tragically cut short, and with no immediate leads, the case quickly grew cold. Despite the clues left behind in her apartment, evidence of a struggle, DNA, and forensic material, her killer remained elusive. For years, her name lingered as an unsolved tragedy, and her family was left without the peace they so desperately sought. When Catherine's case was initially handled, the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, SPVM, working alongside forensic experts from the Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale, LSGML, launched the investigation. Detectives combed through the details of the crime scene, gathered evidence, and conducted interviews with potential witnesses. They were diligent, but no clear suspects emerged. The case became part of Montreal's cold case files, with investigators hoping for a breakthrough that never came. As the years passed, investigators re-examined the case, holding periodic reviews, but no substantial progress was made. In 2015, they turned to public appeals and even released a podcast hoping that someone, somewhere, might know something. But nothing. The case, which had started with so much potential, seemed doomed to linger in the shadows of Montreal's crime history. However, as advancements in forensic science were made, new possibilities for solving cold cases emerged, especially with the rise of genetic genealogy. In 2025, the SPVM made the decision to reopen Catherine Daviau's case, applying modern methods to the preserved evidence. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the case that had gone cold for nearly 2 decades. Despite the evidence that had been collected, the case was never solved using traditional methods. The crime scene DNA, primarily bodily fluids, was preserved, but the STR, short tandem repeat, DNA profiling methods available at the time did not yield a match in any of the available databases. Despite all efforts, the killer's identity remained hidden from view, and the case appeared to stall indefinitely. For years, the lack of genealogical DNA infrastructure in Canada hindered progress. Without the capacity to connect DNA evidence to familial trees or public databases, investigators were left with few tools. For many years, CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, did not offer any leads, and the case remained unsolved. With no further forensic breakthroughs, and with witnesses fading from memory, the case seemed destined to be yet another cold case in Montreal's police archives. But as the world of forensic science continued to evolve, so did the methods that could unlock the truth behind these long unsolved mysteries. By 2025, forensic genetic genealogy had become a revolutionary tool for solving cold cases, and the SPVM, in partnership with LSJML, engaged in the painstaking work of revisiting Catherine Daviau's case. Othram, a renowned forensic genealogy lab, was brought in to apply SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism testing, a method that allows for a more comprehensive examination of degraded DNA. This technique opened new possibilities, as it could build a genealogical profile from trace DNA. Using this reprocessed DNA, investigators were able to trace family connections. The genetic tree built from Catherine's crime scene DNA eventually led them to a suspect, Jacques Bolduc. Through public genealogical databases, investigators linked distant relatives of Bolduc, gradually narrowing down their search. The genealogical connection eventually pinpointed him as a prime suspect. With this lead in hand, investigators moved quickly. They secured a confirmatory DNA sample from Bolduc's family members, whose DNA matched that found at the crime scene. The breakthrough was as thrilling as it was tragic, as it came years after Bolduc's death. He had passed away in 2021, but his connection to Catherine's murder had finally been uncovered, bringing a sense of justice to a case that had been without closure for so long. Jacques Bolduc was never arrested in connection with the crime. By the time his identification was made through genetic genealogy, he had already died in 2021. Although this meant that the case could never go to trial, his identification brought the necessary closure for Catherine's family and the city of Montreal. The breakthrough highlighted how genetic genealogy could finally provide answers, even decades after a case had gone cold. There was no trial, as Bolduc could not face justice for his actions, but the identification alone provided a sense of resolution for the victim's loved ones. Despite the inability to prosecute him, the truth was now known, and it was a bittersweet victory for those who had been waiting for justice for so long. With Jacques Bolduc's posthumous identification, the case was officially closed. However, the full details of his motive remained elusive. Investigators presumed it was a violent domestic homicide, though no official statements were released regarding the specifics of the relationship between Bolduc and Catherine. What is clear is that Bolduc's connection to Catherine, as well as his history of prior offenses, pointed to a pattern of predatory behavior. While the case is officially resolved, many questions linger, particularly regarding the circumstances of their interactions before the murder. Was there a known history between Bolduc and Daviau? Was the crime an opportunistic act, or did they share a deeper connection? These are questions that may never fully be answered, but the identification of Bolduc as the perpetrator allows for a small degree of closure, even if the full details of the crime remain obscured. For Catherine Daviau's family, the long journey to justice had finally culminated in the revelation they had been hoping for. Though the justice they sought would not come in the form of a trial, the identification of Bolduc provided them with the peace of knowing who had been responsible for Catherine's death. It was a bittersweet moment for her family, as they were forced to reconcile with the reality that the man who took Catherine from them could never stand trial. Case 22. Ronald Lee Novak, Iowa Cold Case, 1983. In the cold rural corners of Iowa, the brutal murder of Ronald Lee Novak in 1983 left investigators scrambling for clues. His case, cold for over 4 decades, took a dramatic turn in 2025 when modern forensic techniques, especially DNA analysis, led to the identification of the killer. On December 23, 1983, in the small town of Walker, Iowa, 24-year-old Ronald Lee Novak's life was cruelly taken. His lifeless body was found at a remote site, a place that would later become the silent witness to an unsolved crime for over 40 years. Authorities discovered the young man shot to death, a grim scene that became a chilling part of Iowa's history. Investigators meticulously gathered blood, DNA, and other biological evidence from the crime scene, but these traces would sit dormant for years. Despite the early collection of physical evidence, investigators were left without any solid leads. The case quickly went cold, slipping into the maze of unsolved mysteries that would eventually haunt the local sheriff's office for decades. Early attempts to match the biological evidence failed, as the technology at the time was not advanced enough to make the connections needed. CODIS, the FBI's DNA database, failed to provide a match, and the case grew colder with each passing year. The investigation was initially handled by the Lynn County Sheriff's Department, who, at the time, had little to go on. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and, despite their best efforts, no immediate leads. Detectives canvassed the area, spoke to locals, and re-examined Novak's personal life, trying to piece together any motive or connection that might lead to the killer. DNA evidence, though collected, remained largely untouched due to limitations in forensic science and database accessibility. In the early stages, the sheriff's office remained hopeful, but as years passed, the investigation entered the realm of cold cases, revisited occasionally, but never yielding the breakthrough they desperately needed. The case became a faint echo in the department's files, revisited by new generations of detectives, but never receiving the full attention it warranted. The case lingered in the files, unsolved and forgotten by many, due to various limitations in investigative methods and the absence of modern forensic tools. Traditional DNA analysis had not yet advanced to the level it would reach decades later, and the biological samples collected from the scene were either too degraded or too partial to yield anything useful in early forensic labs. DNA matching technology was limited, and the biological evidence, blood, saliva, and other trace materials, remained without a match in CODIS or any known criminal database. Without a suspect, investigators were unable to develop any real leads, and with no further developments in forensic technology, the case remained in limbo. As the years passed, leads grew sparse, witness memories faded, and new, more urgent cases pulled attention away from the Novak murder. Despite efforts from the Lynn County Sheriff's Department to keep the case active, it gradually became just another cold case, listed with the many unsolved murders that linger in the archives of law enforcement. Genealogical DNA methods, which would later revolutionize the field of cold case investigation, were still years away from being integrated into criminal investigations. These challenges left the case unresolved and pushed Novak's murder further into the past, a haunting mystery with no answers for his family or the community. In 2025, the case was revitalized when the Lynn County Sheriff's Department partnered with forensic DNA experts to re-examine the biological evidence. The advancements in DNA analysis and new forensic methodologies that had emerged in the years since the murder allowed them to reprocess the old samples. Othram, a company specializing in forensic DNA analysis, was brought in to use their advanced techniques, particularly focusing on high-sensitivity DNA profiling. After years of stagnation, the breakthrough came when reprocessed DNA was matched to a person of interest, Michael Shepard, a 64-year-old man from the local area. Investigators had already known about Shepard, but the previous DNA testing methods had not been sensitive enough to link him directly to the crime scene. With the power of genetic genealogy, however, Shepard's name emerged as the primary suspect. Using genealogical methods, investigators traced Shepard's lineage, identifying family members who had direct connections to him. They compared the newly found genetic markers to the DNA from Novak's crime scene, confirming the match. Shepard's arrest was imminent, and the cold case that had haunted Iowa for over 40 years was finally solved. Michael Shepard was arrested in late 2025, following the match between his DNA and the evidence found at the crime scene. His arrest was a culmination of years of investigative work, fueled by cutting-edge DNA technology and the dedicated efforts of the law enforcement teams involved. Though Shepard was apprehended and charged with first-degree murder, the details surrounding his actions and motivation remained shrouded in mystery. Shepard's arrest was bittersweet for many. As the case had remained unsolved for so long, there was a sense of closure, but also the haunting realization that the perpetrator had lived for decades with the knowledge of his crime. The impact on the community and Novak's family was profound. They had waited decades for justice, and now, in their twilight years, they saw the perpetrator brought to justice, but at the cost of time. Shepard's trial and eventual conviction would bring finality to the case. However, his actions and his time on the run had caused immense pain for Novak's loved ones. His legal proceedings and any related sentences would ultimately determine the full impact of his actions. The motive behind Novak's murder was not immediately clear to investigators. However, as the investigation continued, it became apparent that the crime was personal. Shepard's proximity to Novak, including their shared connections and the likelihood that they had crossed paths before, pointed to a possible motive rooted in personal conflict or violence. The brutality of the crime, with Novak being beaten and left in such a remote location, suggested a deeper, darker connection. As the case went to trial, investigators and prosecutors worked to uncover more about Shepard's relationship with Novak. Was it an act of rage, a crime of opportunity, or was there something more insidious at play, a deeper history between the two that had finally boiled over into violence? For the family, the motive remained secondary to the fact that they had finally achieved justice. The mystery surrounding Novak's murder was no longer a black hole in their lives. Answers had finally come, even if they came decades too late. The closure of the case was bittersweet for Novak's family. They had spent years grappling with the uncertainty of his death, wondering if they would ever see justice. The persistence of the Lynn County Sheriff's Department and the advancements in forensic DNA technology gave them the closure they desperately needed, but the toll of those 40 years without answers weighed heavily. Case 23, Nadine Gorchensky, 1999, Niagara, Toronto area, Ontario, Canada. There are cases that stay with a community long after the news cameras move on, stories that linger because they end too early, without clear answers, and because the people involved were loved deeply. The story of 26-year-old Nadine Gorchensky is one of those. To understand what made her loss so devastating, you have to start with who she was before her name ever became connected to a cold case. Nadine was born in Jamaica and came to Canada in 1992 after marrying her Canadian husband, Paul. they settled in St. Catharines, in the Niagara region, where they began building a life. They had 2 children together, Heather and Nash. Those who knew her then remember her as kind-hearted, warm, with a gentle voice, and a natural way of making others feel welcomed. She was a young woman navigating adulthood, motherhood, and marriage in a new country. But like many marriages formed young, life brought challenges the couple struggled to overcome. Eventually, the relationship ended, and Nadine moved to Toronto in search of stability, independence, and a new start. In Toronto, she worked in adult nightlife entertainment, sometimes described in public records as exotic dancing or club work. The nature of her job, however, never defined her within her family. To them, she was still the same loving daughter, the same sister, the same mother who called home often and sent birthday messages, no matter how busy things became. Her family has described her as a beautiful young woman inside and out, mother, wife, and now grandmother, a reminder that her story did not begin or end where she worked. It began with love, and it continued with the people who never stopped waiting for answers. On May 8, 1999, everything changed. That morning, in a rural area near Lincoln, Ontario, along a quiet roadside ditch near Victoria Avenue, someone made a discovery that would alter the course of Nadine's story forever. Responding officers located her partially clothed body and secured the area. The medical examiner determined that her passing had been caused by pressure to the neck, indicating she had been intentionally harmed. Her life had been taken. For investigators, there were starting points: biological evidence, clothing, and trace material, but no immediate suspect. Nadine had been in Toronto shortly before her death, and that alone expanded the possible range of people she may have encountered. Early investigative efforts included interviewing patrons and associates from the establishments she worked in and retracing her recent movements. Police released appeals to the public, hoping someone would step forward with information. Leads came, but none led to an arrest. Over time, the case was not forgotten. It appeared in televised crime programs and was included in a task force reviewing the unresolved deaths of several women in the Niagara region. Detectives believed that, somewhere, someone had crossed paths with Nadine at the wrong moment. Or worse, that her death may have been part of a pattern. But even as the years stretched into decades, no breakthrough came. The DNA collected at the scene remained unmatched in both Canadian and cross-border law enforcement databases. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough yet. Then, more than 20 years later, science finally caught up to the evidence. In 2020, Niagara Regional Police made a pivotal decision. They submitted the preserved forensic material to Othram, a US-based forensic genetics laboratory specializing in advanced DNA sequencing and investigative genetic genealogy, a technique capable of identifying potential suspects by comparing crime scene DNA to partial matches in public genealogical databases, then building out family trees to determine likely individuals. It was a scientific strategy that did not exist in 1999. Now, it was transforming cold cases around North America. The process was meticulous. First, Othram worked to develop a high-resolution DNA profile from the decades-old sample. Then, genealogists constructed and narrowed relational branches, identifying relatives and potential ancestral lines. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Eventually, investigators were directed toward a man who fit the DNA, timeline, and geography. In May 2024, police announced the identity of the person responsible for Nadine's death: Joseph Archie Raymond Brousseau, a truck driver from Northern Ontario. He had been 34 years old at the time she died. The revelation was significant, but it also carried a difficult reality. Brousseau had passed away in 2017, 7 years before investigators confirmed his connection to the crime. He would never face trial, never answer questions, never provide a motive. The case was considered solved based on DNA and genealogical verification, but the legal system would never speak to his intent. When Niagara Regional Police made the announcement, they emphasized 2 things. First, that science had finally given a family the truth they had been waiting for. And second, that Nadine deserved to be seen as more than the circumstances of her death. Closure in this case was not the same as justice, but it was acknowledgement. It was a name. It was an answer. For Nadine's family, who had lived more than 2 decades with grief and uncertainty, the news was heartbreaking and relieving at the same time. Their statements reminded the public that Nadine was not just a case number, not just a file sitting on a shelf. She was a mother whose children grew up without her. She was a daughter whose voice fell silent long before her time. And she is still loved. Today, her story stands as an example of how persistence and evolving science can restore truth long after it seems lost. It is also a reminder of how important it is to preserve evidence, maintain case integrity, and continue reviewing unsolved crimes, because answers may simply be waiting for the right tools to uncover them. And for her family, one certainty remains. Nadine is remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. Case 24. Velma Louise Silva Lee. Canal Skull. 2013 remains, California, USA. In 2013, skeletal remains were found near the Acid Canal in Redding, California, but remained unidentified for 12 years. In 2025, authorities in Othram identified the remains as Velma Louise Silva Lee via forensic genealogy. On March 11, 2013, a cleanup crew stumbled upon human remains near the Anderson-Cottonwood Irrigation District Canal in Redding, California. The skeletal remains, including a skull, were found in an area of denser brush, a grim discovery that would later come to be known as the Canal Skull. Despite an initial effort by the Shasta County Sheriff's Office, SCSO, and local forensic experts, the identity of the remains remained elusive. Early DNA analyses did not lead to a match in the standard missing person databases, and the victim, at the time, was not reported missing. The remains were cataloged, but without any leads, the case began to fade into the cold case files. The initial attempts to identify the deceased woman were unsuccessful. As is often the case with unidentified remains, the lack of familial connection in DNA databases meant that this case lacked the immediate familial match required for a speedy identification. Without a missing persons report to connect the remains to a specific individual, the case sat in limbo, unsolved, for nearly a decade. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office, aided by the County Coroner's Office and forensic pathologists, led the investigation into the identity of the remains. Initially, the team used conventional methods. DNA samples from the remains were submitted to CODIS, the National DNA Database, but no match was made. Without a missing persons report or familial connection, progress slowed to a crawl. For years, the case languished in cold case files, as investigators had little to go on. But during the period of 2017-2018, the importance of forensic genealogy began to gain traction within law enforcement. With the evolution of forensic science, a new tool emerged: genetic genealogy. By 2023, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram, a forensic genetic genealogy laboratory, to apply these new advanced techniques to the long unresolved case. During the cold years, the primary issue preventing identification was the degradation of the DNA samples. In 2013, the forensic tests performed on the skeletal remains showed that the DNA was insufficient for a match using the standard STR, short tandem repeat profiling methods. Furthermore, as the DNA had been degraded over time, early methods for matching with family members in the database were ineffective. This compounded the frustration that comes with such long unsolved cases, as the database lacked familial samples from the woman's family, which could have directly linked them to the remains. Compounding this issue, the victim's family had no formal contact with her for many years. As investigators worked with the available data, there was no record of her disappearance or a family member's input to help in the search for a match. The case remained open but ultimately stagnant, a nameless tragedy that became a dark chapter in the investigation files of Shasta County. In 2023, a turning point arrived. With the rise of genetic genealogy, a new wave of hope sparked the case forward. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office collaborated with Othram, a cutting-edge forensic lab known for using genealogical DNA techniques to crack cold cases. The breakthrough method of using forensic genealogy enabled the team to generate a comprehensive DNA profile from the remains and link it to a genealogical family tree. Through Othram's analysis, genealogists were able to trace distant relatives connected to the victim's genetic profile. As the family tree was pieced together, they identified several potential matches, which eventually led them to Velma Louise Silva Lee. Genetic genealogist teams worked closely with the investigators to cross-check multiple family branches, eliminating false leads and narrowing down the possibilities. By September 15, 2025, Othram confirmed the identity of the victim. DNA samples from Lee's son provided the critical link, and forensic analysis validated the match. The confirmation led to a long-awaited closure for the investigation, marking the end of a 12-year search to give a name to the remains. The announcement came as a monumental moment in forensic history, especially given the success of genealogical tools in cracking this case wide open after so many years. The identification of Velma Louise Silva Lee's remains is, at its core, an identification case, meaning that no arrest was made for the murder of Lee. The investigation into her death remains open, and while the case is identified, there are still significant questions about the circumstances surrounding her death. Given that the case has just been reopened after identifying the victim, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office has stated that it will continue to pursue leads and actively investigate the cause of death, possible suspects, and further details of the circumstances. Lee's son was informed of the identification, which allowed him to finally bring closure to a long period of uncertainty. Authorities have expressed their intent to continue working the case, but at this time, there have been no suspects named or arrests made related to her murder. While the identity restoration is a major step forward, the community continues to seek justice for Velma Louise Silva Lee. The identification of Velma Louise Silva Lee marks the conclusion of a tragic chapter that had remained unresolved for over a decade. As investigators continue to probe the circumstances of Lee's death, questions surrounding her motive remain unclear. Public sources have not elaborated on the specifics of why or how she ended up in the remote area near the canal. But there are indications that she had been estranged from her family for many years before her tragic demise. As the investigation continues, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office has yet to release detailed information regarding Lee's cause of death or any potential suspects involved in her murder. Some speculate that her death may have been linked to a domestic dispute or some form of violence, but no concrete evidence has surfaced publicly to confirm any specific motive. For now, the case remains open, with authorities working to piece together the remaining details. There is also a significant interest in uncovering further forensic evidence and witness testimony that may shed light on who was responsible for her death. However, one thing is certain: Lee's identity has been restored, and her memory will live on in the hearts of her family, who can finally begin to grieve with closure. In an emotional statement following the identification of Velma Louise Silva Lee, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office emphasized that the breakthrough would allow her family to move forward, knowing the truth about what happened to their loved one. The family expressed relief and deep gratitude for the efforts of the investigators and genealogists who made this possible. Case 25, Lambduan Armitage, Lady of the Hills, 2004, UK. In 2004, skeletal remains of a woman were found in the Pen y Ghent area of the Yorkshire Dales, later nicknamed Lady of the Hills. In 2019, she was identified as Lambduan Sikanya, Lambduan Armitage, via DNA. On the morning of September 21, 2004, hikers exploring the rugged terrain of Pen y Ghent, part of the Yorkshire Dales, stumbled upon skeletal remains in a secluded area. The discovery of the remains was both an eerie and significant event for the local community and law enforcement. Initial forensic analysis determined that the remains belonged to a woman, likely in her 30s or 40s at the time of death, and had been there for several years. Investigators were immediately struck by the absence of any personal belongings or identifying items at the scene. It was clear that the woman had traveled far from home before meeting her untimely death. But who she was and how she came to be in such a remote location remained a mystery. As local authorities worked to piece together the evidence, they struggled to match the woman's identity to any missing persons reports or local residents. Despite their best efforts, including reviewing missing persons cases and conducting forensic examinations of the remains, they hit a wall. It became clear that the victim was not a local and that solving the case would require innovative thinking and new methods. Yet, with no clear leads, the case was soon relegated to the cold case file, a mysterious and unresolved chapter in the history of the Yorkshire Dales. The case was initially led by the North Yorkshire Police, with additional support from local coroners' offices and forensic experts. The investigation included an exhaustive search for missing persons reports and a review of historical data, but nothing connected the remains to a specific person. Local detectives worked tirelessly, but despite their efforts, the case grew colder as the months and years passed without any leads. Given the isolated location of the remains, investigators theorized that the woman's death could have been related to some form of foul play, but they lacked the forensic evidence needed to confirm any such theory. With time, and as the trail grew cold, the investigation was briefly shelved. Yet, the case was never fully forgotten. Authorities continued to hold out hope that new forensic methods could help them solve the mystery one day. For more than a decade, the case was stagnant. Despite ongoing efforts to match the victim's DNA with missing persons reports, no breakthroughs were made. The DNA profiles extracted from the remains were not conclusive enough to make a match with any known individuals in the national databases. As the years wore on, the DNA evidence itself began to degrade, and the case grew even colder. Without genetic genealogy and more advanced forensic methods, the chances of solving the case appeared to diminish with time. As technological advancements in forensic science slowly progressed, it became clear that cross-jurisdictional collaboration would be vital. The victim's lack of identification became even more frustrating, given the absence of any major suspects or solid leads. For years, the victim remained nameless. Lady of the Hills, a haunting reminder of a case unsolved. Yet, despite the setbacks, the investigation remained open, and hope remained that one day the truth would come to light. In 2019, the investigation took a dramatic turn. In a bold move, the North Yorkshire Police, in collaboration with genealogists and forensic DNA experts, applied the emerging technique of forensic genetic genealogy. This technique, which had already been used in several high-profile cases around the world, allowed investigators to trace distant familial connections through public DNA databases. Working with genealogical experts, the investigators were able to match the remains to a distant relative in Thailand. Through this connection, they were able to build a family tree and track the victim's identity to a woman named Lamduan Sikanya, later known as Lamduan Armitage after her marriage. The next phase of the investigation involved confirming the victim's identity through genetic testing. The breakthrough was profound, but the case was far from over. Lamduan had been married to a British man, David Armitage, and had moved to the UK with him several years before her death. Investigators immediately turned their focus to David Armitage, whose relationship with Lamduan raised several red flags. With the identification of Lamduan confirmed, the investigation quickly shifted to examining her relationship with her husband, David. Evidence began to point to a troubled marriage, with tensions between the couple and a potential history of domestic violence. Authorities were now looking at David Armitage as the prime suspect in her murder. In February 2025, investigators made a pivotal move. Armed with new DNA evidence and information gathered from genealogical research, they arrested David Armitage on suspicion of his wife's murder. The arrest was a major turning point in the case, as it connected the investigation's findings to a specific individual. However, despite the arrest, the case is still in progress. As of now, David Armitage has not been convicted, and the full details of the murder remain under investigation. His arrest brought some relief to Lamduan's family, who had long awaited answers, but questions still linger regarding the full scope of the crime and the motive behind her death. The resolution of the case has provided Lamduan's family with some much-needed closure, though there is still much to learn about her murder. Investigators have speculated that the motive behind Lamduan's death may be tied to a history of domestic violence, but no definitive motive has yet been publicly disclosed. Authorities have indicated that the case is still ongoing, and the full forensic report, including the cause of death and any possible additional charges, will likely be revealed during trial proceedings. For Lamduan's family, the identification of her remains marks an emotional and poignant moment in their long journey for answers. While the case is not yet concluded, they can finally lay her to rest with dignity and closure. knowing that the truth about her death has been uncovered. However, the larger question of David Armitage's role in her death remains unresolved. Was her murder the result of a personal conflict that escalated? Or is there more to the story than what has been uncovered so far? These are questions that only time and a trial may answer. The resolution of Lam Duan's case has been a bittersweet victory for her family. While the truth about her death has finally been revealed, the pain of losing her under such tragic circumstances remains. Her relatives in Thailand and the UK have expressed both grief and relief, mourning the loss of a woman they loved, but also grateful for the perseverance of the investigators who never gave up on solving her case. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love.